Good morning, good morning. My name is André Faaij. I am affiliated to the University of Groningen as professor in the field of energy system analysis and still the formal project leader of the ENSYSTRA program that started a long time ago. I will say a little bit about that in a few seconds. And I had the very good tradition when I'm kicking off conferences to walk with a microphone to the hallway to tell people that we have started. For example, part of the organization, we have started. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Excellent. And also good morning to everybody who is online. And what I understood is that there will be a considerable number of people joining. And yeah, that's of course the symptom of the COVID pandemic that has hit ENSYSTRA also very hard. Fortunately, there is a small but elite group of people here physically, which is already a relief, but a large part, of course, of the program was done on long distance, and we have endured that. So already my respect for that, and ENSYSTRA has run well during that period. But we are now here to come to sort of a formal close of ENSYSTRA, because as a Marie Curie training network funded by the European Commission, it has an official duration of 3 years, and we are now more or less at the end of the 3 years. Which also means that some of the PhD researchers that are part of that have already finalized. In quite a number of cases also there are extensions provided, 4 years, sometimes even a little bit more. So the work will continue, but this is also an official closing event of the ENSYSTRA project. And we chose a Muiden, the harbor, as a location, and that is most appropriate because besides that it is on that side a nice piece of coast, and there is North Sea, and if you look well, it's pretty bright. You can see wind turbines there, and they're emerging by the day. So that is developments that we are all working on. And then on that side, there is one of the biggest steel mills in Europe, Tata Steel, for which you could join a virtual tour yesterday with their explanations on the current process and their future plans. And the future plans, that is a hot issue at the moment, almost symbolic for why ENSYSTRA was created. Because that is the largest single CO2 emitter of the Netherlands. It's also one of the largest in Northwestern Europe. And the decision has, of course, been taken to bring that down to zero, or even close the entire plant if it can't. So that is now the societal debate around one very big industry just around the corner. But the key strategy that is now adopted is that they want to move to using hydrogen, preferably hydrogen from green electricity. And that should, of course, come from the North Sea. So that is a direct link here to all the work that we have been doing. The situation is that if that would happen, the plant on that size, about all wind energy capacity available today in the Dutch territory, on land and offshore, would be needed for that plant alone. So that is a little indication of the challenges that we are working on and that you're all aware of. So an appropriate location. Well, ENSYSTRA, it started actually 5-6 years ago when the acquisition of the project was started, definitely with a clear notion North Sea is important, and the objectives were, of course, to provide a training network for institutions, for universities around the North Sea, so 5 countries, 5 universities gathered in that team, and also with the key objective, interdisciplinary work. Because of course it is about technology, of course it is about energy systems, but it is a complete system change we're looking at, and that needs to be implemented. How do you do that? It is an international matter where coordination is preferred, but not always there. It is about markets, and it is also about how do actors behave, how can we stimulate them, what triggers them, what actually triggers their decisions, like Tata Steel here around the corner. And all those components were put together in the ENSYSTRA program, and of course it's still nice to recall that, but we got the highest grades imaginable in evaluation of the proposal and got it. And I think that was definitely correct that they did that evaluation on that level. We wrote, of course, a very good proposal, but the topic cannot even have been hotter if you have seen the developments over the past years while ENSYSTRA was carried out. What was, of course, absolutely of massive importance for Europe is the EU Green Deal, and as part of that, the sharpening of the emission trading system in Europe, and also the sharpening of the emission reduction targets, 55% down in 2030. So that is around the corner. And the Green Deal means there are substantial funds available to secure the investments. And the emission trading system is really a very serious improvement, because we're now seeing prices around 60 euros per ton of CO2 emitted, and that has an effect on the industrial players. It has already an effect on the electricity production mix of the countries around the North Sea, and it definitely pushes the developments with marine energy, wind offshore in particular, forward. So the amount of investment, the capacity that has been created in the meantime, and that is scheduled, is absolutely staggering. So the developments have really underpinned why ENSYSTRA is important. On top of that, of course, the latest IPCC report. We're still waiting for the mitigation report of Working Group 3 that will be published in March next year. But the update on the speed of climate change has been most disturbing. And today it's not a matter of reports, you can just see it around you, wherever you go. And if you're really unlucky, the damage is really bad. So that also pushes things forward. And on top of that, the International Energy Agency has also translated all these notions to their global scenarios, saying investments in any fossil capacity should be stopped right away. There was an interesting announcement from China yesterday on that, so that is a good signal. But the changes are quite immense. So you see now different behavior in industry. Tata Steel is an example, but also the petrochemical industry in the ARA cluster in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Germany, on the move, talking about hydrogen backbones, about CCS infrastructure that should all be connected to the North Sea. The spatial claims are becoming very evident, because I think at the start we're talking something about 150, 200 gigawatt capacity of wind offshore. 300 plus has been mentioned by Frans Timmermans recently. And if we take the ambitions on hydrogen supply for industry serious, we are well going to cross the 300 gigawatt mark for the North Sea alone. So that is absolutely massive. The system integration questions that are now already real, how to accommodate that fluctuating energy supply, is already translated. We need hydrogen transport. Investments are already done in electrolyzer capacity in different industrial sites. And also the planning of the artificial islands is ongoing as well, which were artist impressions when we started the ENSYSTRA project. So all of this is ongoing, and ENSYSTRA is in the middle of it. Well, this conference is, of course, first of all about reporting results. So the key speakers, either here or online, are the ESRs, it's still a stupid abbreviation, the researchers, the scientists that are now have either finalized or are coming to the final phase of their work, and there is a formidable amount of results. I have the pleasure and honor to supervise still 3 ongoing projects, and that is absolutely of crucial importance that those type of insights are there, and that's true for the entire ENSYSTRA program. So we have results on the system modeling, we have results on technology, we have results on the markets and on the actor behavior. All the key components are there, and we'll also discuss the links. But besides that, of course, there are also secondment partners, our key partners in the project that facilitate the research, provided information, supervision, etc. Several are here online, there will be presentations, and also of other key stakeholders. And ENSYSTRA would not have been possible without them. It is such a critical component, and I think the mingling of the scientific research and the real world in this project couldn't have been done better if you look at current developments. So that is also something that can be further discussed during this conference. What we can also say already on forehand is that we started with the ambition to do 15 PhD projects, and they're all there. They're either completed or they're ongoing, and that's, we expect 100% score. On top of that, and Dirk and Kim know everything about it, it is quite a challenge to manage a project like this, especially during a pandemic. The program also got a lot of compliments along the time for being well managed, for being on track, for delivering, and that is a compliment in itself because it's a complex endeavor, and really credit to my colleagues, Dirk, Kim, and also Deborah supporting that. On top of that, I want to thank also the team for organizing this, because it was also a challenge to come to a hybrid event, do all the logistics. And there, Deborah, I don't know where you are, but right there. Wonderful job, and that's really worth a big compliment. And would like to give the floor to Professor Olaf Hohmeijer from University of Flensburg, one of the people from the first hour of ENSYSTRA, to kick off the first content session. So Olaf, here you go.
Thanks a lot. Well, good morning from my side. We are kind of handing over the mic, so that I had to come over and grab it from André. Thank you, André, for the invitation for a great venue. It was a little bit complicated to get here, but once we were here, we all enjoyed it thoroughly to be here. So welcome to the first session. The first session actually is on the energy modeling. Energy modeling of what's going on in the future in the North Sea if all these ambitions are combined and all the targets are supposed to be met. So how does that all fit together? It's highly complex because it has to fit into a European system with not just a little bit of wind or lots of wind in the North Sea. It's a lot of other energy sources around us. It's many countries that are connecting even just around the North Sea, which is just a part of the European network. So how does that all fit together? And at the end of the day, is there, for example, enough space to meet all these ambitions? Now, today, this is almost a given that we're discussing these things. But a few years back, just go back 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years, people would have called you crazy, saying this is the future. People looked at me like I was from the asylum for the people who wear the white jackets with the arms on the back, when I said the future is in the North Sea, and it's in connections between the countries, because in some countries we have a lot of demand, and we may even have some good resources. But one thing that we're lacking is storage. And if we look at the big systems of the future, many people say batteries, batteries, batteries. Look at all the chemistry that will be necessary if we do batteries for everything. And then I watched TV. Actually, my wife told me about something that was sent in the afternoon when she was doing the ironing. And she watched a movie or a report on TV while she was ironing. And somebody appeared in that documentation, a very nice guy who didn't look like much, and he was standing in front of a obviously small lake and was telling a story about Norway. Norway being a very important part of the future energy system. And this person was Lars Audun Fodstad. Lars is with us today, and he was one of the visionaries. When everybody said, you're crazy, Lars already knew how it would work and how important it would be to connect the huge Norwegian hydropower system to the rest of Europe. And he got me hooked on the idea that we will need the North Sea as a connection part between at least Germany, where we were looking into the possible future of 100% renewable Germany, and the lack of storage. And I saw this man on TV, and he said, we have all the storage that you need. We can be the green battery for Europe. And that was the vision that I brought to the Council of Environmental Advisors in Germany, where we did this study. When we introduced this study, still, people said, you're crazy. It's never going to work. It's the Norwegian system, that doesn't work because everything goes right into the fjord, and then you cannot pump back salt water. And of course, I knew from Lars that no, it's not just one lake and it devoters into the fjord. It's cascades of lakes which are connected and which you can connect backwards. But Lars will tell you far more about this. He is one of the visionaries behind this and who helped us find the way to this. So I'm so glad you made it here, and you can tell us a little bit more about that vision. Now, am I supposed to hand over this microphone?
No,
You have your own. Okay, then I'm most likely, somebody in the back is going to switch this off, is that correct?
yeah. Well, you hear me? Yes. Well, early visions of North Sea connection. I worked upon this to be able to say something in 20 minutes. It's a very short time. And I wanted to tell you about my background for it, but I think I shall be very short about the background. I think the better is that I just show you a slide from one of the presentations I had around at that time, 10 years ago. I have slides from a presentation I had really in Amsterdam in 2011. That was not the first one. I had presentations at a huge number of conferences and meetings, and started earlier. I was involved, I had a background from hydropower, of course, and different jobs and occupations in Norway. But I was early involved also international in Euroelectric, the organization for the power industry, and also in IEA, the International Energy Agency. So I got a large network and worked upon these ideas. So I will jump now on the first, just here. It was my personal background. It was hydropower characteristics and evolution and expansion of renewable energy lacking flexibility in Europe. That was the background. And then there is more details here. I will jump. And just about hydropower characteristics. It's multi-professional, and it is flexible, quick responding on regulating needs, storage possibilities, especially for hydropower with reservoirs, and Norway has alone close to half of the European reservoir capacity. Pump storage possibilities, Norway can develop huge pumped storage capacity. So I will jump, you know about the wind and solar expansion, so I will be. But the timeline for renewable energy in the EU is best illustrated by this figure to the left, the different RES directives. The first directive from 2001 set national indicative targets for the electricity production from renewables. But indicative targets did not deliver what was needed. The Commission communication of 9th October 2006, entitled Action Plan for Energy Efficiency, realizing the potential, was endorsed by the European Council of March 2007 and by the European Parliament in its resolution 31st of January 2008. And that paved the way for a more effective directive. So the second directive from 2009 set EU target of 20% renewables by 2020 and national binding targets. And that was, in a way, a turning point for me. Because when I looked upon, now it is binding targets, then the different countries are obliged to do something, and it will expand the amount of not regular, it will be a need for more storage and regulating power sources, because wind is not regulated. It is producing when it's blowing, and when it's not blowing, it's non-production. So I just decided to end my career in Sierra Kvina Kraftselskap and work all the time with these things. And then Statkraft was allowing me to do this, and I worked for Statkraft the last years of my career. And here is back to my presentation from Amsterdam. It was then the North Sea area wind power development 2020 scenario, offshore 40,000 megawatt, total onshore offshore 100,000 megawatt, and creating a wind belt, as you see on the figure. And the huge challenges then is the infrastructure development, connecting variable renewable sources to load centers, flexibility options, storage facilities, and it is necessary for enabling the market development. And then it's handling the variability, as I said, and it creates a need for huge flexibility in the other parts of the electricity system. So bringing transmission challenges, bringing 40,000 megawatt onshore, and bringing 100,000 megawatt to the load centers. It's difficult, but it has to be done to upgrade the AC overhead lines and perhaps HVDC cable connections also onshore. And of course, in the sea, you have to use high voltage DC. At that time, possible new Norwegian interconnections for 2020 is listed here. Some of them have been realized. It's Skagerrak 4 realized, Norlink is realized, the Southwest Link to a certain degree, that's in Sweden, and Nordnet 2 is not realized. Norger is not realized. Instead, Norlink was realized. And then the connection to UK is now under testing. So it will be realized operating in a few months. And it's interesting also to look upon the EU infrastructure development and the Commission communication of 2010. It focused upon 4 priority corridors, and the first one was offshore grid in the northern seas and connection to northern as well as Central Europe. I don't think I use time for the other. And the offshore grid in the northern seas, connecting to northern as well as Central Europe, to integrate and connect energy production capacities in the northern seas with consumption centers in northern and Central Europe and hydro storage facilities in the Alpine region and in the Nordic country. That's taken from the EU documents. And it's interesting to see this. And I'll go ahead. And then also from the German government's energy concept, Energiewende. I think it was in 2010, if I don't remember wrong. And I visited the top administration in the government in Germany before that, together with a person from Statnett. And I think we influenced the text here, in fact. So it's, as it is pointed in green here, in the long term, this potential, also the potential for flexibility is not sufficient. Therefore, the use of foreign pump storage plants to boost Germany's supply is of great significance. Formidable potential for this exists in Norway, but the Alps can also be tapped further. The German government will begin talks with Norway and the Alpine countries with the involvement of energy companies in order to achieve long-term energy supply cooperation with European partners, with a special view to the creation and use of energy shortage capacity. So it's interesting to see what is taken into the text. And also a similar against UK from the offshore valuation, the Boston Consulting Group in 2010. It's much of the same thinking about this, connecting variable renewables to the possibilities in Norway. And I will also hear a little bit about the smoothing effect with wind over different large areas. You see here, if you look upon the green one, the light green, it's only Netherlands in 2020, as it was seen in 2010. And the variations are very high. And then if you have different alternatives, but even if you take all the UCTE, Great Britain and Nordel, all of it, you will still have that black curve showing quite large variations. So you cannot do enough by interconnect the different wind sources. And here it's numbers for these variations. Flexibility options then. Production, primarily reservoir-based hydro. And storage, pump storage. CAES was a topic at that time, compressed air energy storage. But I don't think it has been realized in a quantity at all. And then, of course, batteries and electrical vehicles was thought about. And then smart grid solutions. But connecting and further develop the Norwegian hydro resource to deliver a significant part of the needed flexibility was my question. And there, if we look upon the European situation then, hydro storage capacity and rated power in 98. And it is not very different today or in 2011. UCTE, 57 terawatt hours, 49 gigawatt. Norway, 84.1 terawatt hour, 27.3 gigawatt. and Nordell also there. But the point is that developed as the UCTE hydro, Norwegian hydro should have had 72.3 gigawatt installed. So the installation in Norway is not for historic, for peak deliverance. It is for deliver all the power, all the year in Norway. But this means there is a huge possibilities to expand the installation in Norway, Norwegian hydro, to serve peak power needs, just to install more capacity in the existing power stations. And also the structure of the Norwegian hydro is especially well suited for expanding the capacity and also for development of pump storage, as I focus on that slide. Because it's from one reservoir through tunnels and power stations to the next reservoir, as Olaf said, in a cascade, and it ends in the sea. So this is a figure about Siracuina, where I was CEO many years ago. 13 years ago I finished there. And there is, as I see and saw then at that time, expansions possibilities in southern Norway, 7 to 8 gigawatt, converting from base load to peak and load production by installing additional generators in the existing power stations. And pump storage, installed capacity at that time was only 1 gigawatt and mainly built for seasonal pumping. Expansion possibilities in southern Norway, 15 to 20 gigawatt. Then if we looked upon to have a storage capacity for continuous pumping 120 hours, 5 days. Using only existing reservoirs, but upstream, both upstream and downstream. So I see the time is running out, so I will not speak much longer now. But it's pointed out why this is a nice opportunity. And then I looked upon benefits from it, examples. And the final question, continental UK wind resources and Norwegian hydro, a perfect match. Yes, and then I have some references there. And I think to hold the timetable, I have to end there. But you'll find more in the slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And well, it's amazing how this has developed within the last 10, 15 years, from just a vision to links that are already existing by now and they're operational. Yes. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce Laura Guzatu. She's a PhD candidate at the planning department of the Faculty of Spatial Sciences at the University of Groningen. She's our specialist in, okay, do we really have the space and what happens? So quite naturally, her presentation will be spatial potentials and environmental effects of offshore wind farm development in the North Sea basin. And she may tell us, is this all possible, or do we have more restrictions and we can't have all the high-flying plans realized? Please, Laura.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and also thank you for the previous presentation. It was very, very interesting to hear more about from the perspective of from Mr. Lars. So as it was mentioned before, I would present the spatial potentials and environmental impacts of offshore wind farms. I will briefly go through the current and future spatial constraints of the development of offshore wind farms, the future opportunities, but also the environmental impacts of the large-scale deployment. And last, I will present, I would say, a few words about the impact or the insertion of spatial and non-spatial components in the energy models. As it was mentioned before, the North Sea is perceived as a very attractive basin for deploying large-scale wind farms due to the very reliable wind resource, the relatively shallow waters, especially in the south, but also the proximity to the energy markets. However, this is not completely true because the offshore space is divided between a multitude of activities, and we can, just to count for a number of them, we have military activities, we have a large network of protected areas for different marine species, we have oil and gas infrastructure, cables and pipelines, we have the traditional fishing activity, shipping, and in this mix we need to also include the large-scale deployment of offshore wind farms. How will this be realized in a sustainable manner while also safeguarding the marine environment? Traditionally, these activities have been managed in a sectoral manner from international and national legislation such as UNCLOS, OSPAR legislation, or more nationally the Mining Act, just to give a few examples. However, recently through the Marine Strategy Directive, the North Sea countries will need to provide marine spatial plans that account for all these activities in an integrated manner. However, this is not a straightforward process, and just to give an impression of which are those spatial claims in the North Sea, we have compiled a repository of offshore activities and their footprint in the North Sea area. And you can see here the North Sea basin surrounded by North Sea countries, also divided by the exclusive economic zones through the red lines. And we have oil and gas installations, pipelines, shipping lines, military areas. This, however, only gives just a brief grasp of what are those activities in the present, because there are also future claims to be considered. There are more offshore, more shipping lines that will be taken into account, linking the southern part of the North Sea, for example, the Dutch ports to the northern part of the North Sea. We also have the depletion of oil and gas resources, which would lead to decommissioning of oil and gas infrastructure in the Dutch and the Danish EEZ, but we also have new fields being discovered in the Scottish part. We have cables, Natura 2000 areas, waste disposal and fishing activities, but we also need to take into account the future, the increased concerns on marine environment, and therefore the commitment of national governments to provide more space for Natura 2000 areas, and you have circled in the second map locations of these areas. In order to account for all these claims and to calculate the availability of space for offshore wind farms, in the future we have compiled and developed and visualized a number of 4 scenarios, taking into account 2 main drivers, namely the national interpretation of energy targets, of EU energy targets at the national level, but also the type of planning of offshore activities. So we have either sectoral planning, which takes into account the interest of individual sectors, but we can also have integrated planning, which takes into account in a balancing manner all claims offshore and is promoting a participatory process. So those are the main drivers, but we also have secondary drivers, which implies taking into account the dynamic offshore space, so therefore the future claims for more protected areas, the decommissioning of oil and gas platforms, but also more shipping lanes or a higher intensity of shipping activity. We also took into account two techno-economic drivers related to the cost of offshore wind farms. So we divided the space by distance to shore and water depth, as distance to shore is related to the type of foundation, either fixed bottom or floating. And the water depth is related to the cost of the system, so cost of installation, operational maintenance, but also extension of the grid. And you can see on the right side of the slide the visualization of the 4 scenarios, going from scenario A, which is a scenario with high targets and integrated planning. That means we take into account the possibility to have more claims offshore from other activities, but we also take into account the possibility to combine activities through multi-use of space. And we also have scenario C, which is the opposite, having sectoral planning, but also low targets. That means the energy deployment will not be prioritized, and we will have even more claims offshore. And as you can see in all scenarios, we have a low availability of space in the southern part of the North Sea, marked by the white beige areas. And also a higher availability the further we go from the shore, so in areas with the water depth below -55, and that emphasizes the need to deploy floating offshore wind farms. When we're looking at areas that are under 100 kilometers from shore and above -120 meters, we can see a big impact played by the multi-use of space. So in scenarios A and B, we can have an extra 20 or 30 gigawatts only when considering multi-use of space on top of single use. And that brings us to the multi-use of space concept, which is one of the key elements seen in tackling the scarcity of space offshore. And one of the most controversial multi-use of space options is the combination with fisheries. In our scenarios, we can see that this takes place mainly over 100 kilometers from shore and can bring consistent additional gigawatts. We can also have multi-use with marine protected areas or with a natural environment. Also taking place over 100 kilometers from shore. Therefore, in meeting the EU targets in an integrated manner, we can consider multi-use with fisheries or with protected areas. We, however, need to take into account the different trade-offs. And to name a few, we have the design adaptation of offshore wind farms to accommodate these activities. We need to take into account the data, knowledge exchange between those sectors at an early stage in the planning process. We also need to understand the social-cultural impacts of fisheries displacement, for example. And we need to have in place financial instruments for future research in better understanding the impacts that can occur in those interactions. And last but not least, we need to have monitoring programs to better understand the risks and effects on the marine environment. And that leads me to the second part of the presentation, which is the environmental impacts of offshore wind farms. And we can see that with the large-scale deployment of offshore wind farms, and you have them plotted in the map on the right side of the screen, there are increased concerns related to the cumulative pressures on the already notably impacted marine ecosystem. And we know that offshore wind farms, in the authorization process, they need to go through the environmental impact assessment that takes into account the pressures on the environmental components. However, currently there are a number of gaps that can be classified in spatial gaps and temporal gaps. And just briefly, the spatial gaps are related to the mismatch between the scales at which the impacts are assessed and the scale at which ecosystems function. So we know that anthropogenic pressures have transboundaries pressures, so they're not limited on local space. We also have temporal gaps because we need to take into account the different timescales of offshore wind farm pressures. but also we need to monitor those pressures on the long term. In order to account for these environmental impacts, we used a geospatial model called Tools for MSP, developed by Stefano Menegon and Daniel de Pellegrin. This model is taking into account the spatial distribution of pressures, the sensitivities of different environmental components, and calculates, therefore, the impact of different activities, in our case, offshore wind farms. We compiled a repository of offshore wind farms on a temporal scale. Therefore, we are taking into account the construction phase, so the duration of the construction phase, operation phase, and decommissioning phase. And we selected relevant environmental components from seabed habitats to mammals, seabirds, and fish. And you can see on this slide the area occupied by offshore wind farm phases. So we have a peak around 2023 of construction phase related activities, and then a decrease of construction and increase of operation phase activities. However, I need to mention that we took into account the existing and existing and operational offshore wind farms. Therefore, there will be even more impacts to be accounted for after 2027, which is the last year that we have in our analysis. We also made the difference between the countries. So we see UK as having the highest impact, and we also made differences in results between the different phases, and we see the peak in impacts in the construction phase from 2022 to 2026, followed by the plateau of impacts. When looking at the spatial distribution of impacts, we also see different hotspots of impacts. And looking overall for the entire analyzed timeline, we can see areas of high impact, concentrated high impacts, and areas of dispersed impacts in Germany and in UK. And these results can support the decision-making process and can formulate alternatives, options for the location of offshore wind farms in the North Sea space. And to end with, this spatial data can represent an important input in energy models by offering a more realistic representation of the constraints and opportunities offshore. It can show potentials of different renewable technologies, and it can offer an input into the clustering and aggregation of data. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And we see we don't have all that much space in the North Sea, and it will take some good planning, and it will have impact. Now, connecting to that question is what Christian Fleischer did in modeling. And he will tell us about the use of spatial data to build energy system models. Christian is a PhD at the University of Flensburg, where he's doing energy system modeling and specifically looking at the integration of the whole thing, all of Europe, the sector coupling and everything. So what are the data and how do we use the data? Spatial data, the resolution that we need for the models that we actually see what's going on. So, Christian, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Thank you for the introduction, Olaf, and for the former presenters, for your insights. I will be talking more about the use of spatial data when we build energy system models. First of all, what do we need to build a model? So I'm focused here, this diagram focuses on the power system optimization model, but a similar graph could be used for one that is sector coupled if you want to add heat. There are different components that you need to add in your model, and these components have a spatial and a temporal aspect, and they need to be represented in your optimization model if you want to have a representation that is capturing the variation of the renewables and also capture some storage and transmission networks that you want to depict in your model and understand them accurately. So you need to have some representation of your demand, and demand is also spatially distributed across Europe. You have your capacity factors, and capacity factors basically describe the amount of energy that you can produce in different areas. When are they available? In what seasons do you maybe have more of renewables available in a specific area? So how can you tap into those areas and minimize maybe the need for storage or transmission? And you also need to have understand what are your constraints. So Laura gave a good introduction of what are the spatial constraints in the North Sea, but spatial constraints are everywhere. They're also on land. We have cities, you have constraints within the cities where you can place your renewables, and PV is a renewable technology that is actually suited for cities, but as opposed to wind, that is, we have restrictions, legal frameworks that specify where you're supposed to place your wind turbines. So all of this needs to be taken into account when you are developing your power system model. And unfortunately, I could not fit these drawings much larger, but I tried to break down sort of the regions that are of interest to me when I develop my energy system models. And even here you can see some resolution of the available data that we have. And data is sort of the key component when you're developing your energy system model. You need to have it at a resolution that gives a good representation of that area, but still the data still has to be accurate. So for example, when you are looking at the available resources, so the first column here, you have what you would call the potential, energy yield potential for solar and wind. And as you can see, areas that are close to the North Sea, sort of Norway and Denmark, because also offshore wind is represented in this graph, you can see that these areas have good resource for energy yield, so production of energy from wind. And as we go into the southern areas, you can see that Spain also with their solar potential, and their actually it's a combination of how much area is available, land area, and also a combination of the amount of solar potential that is in that area. So you can see that in the southern areas like Spain, you have good energy yield. And this also can be seen in the Balkan areas, where you also have some good solar resources and some large land area that might be possible to develop more solar. On the second column, we have a representation of the demand. Where is the demand located? It's not everywhere. If we look in sort of the northeastern part, demand is very much concentrated in Germany and in Poland. So these are some of the big countries that consume a lot of energy. And here I use population as a proxy because we don't really have a good measure of energy demand at very low spatial resolution. What we do in energy modeling, we look at parameters, variables that give us a proxy of where the demand could be, and population and GDP are good proxies. Population has been, there is spatial data for population at very low resolution, and this can be used in energy system models, as opposed to GDP, where we only have it at municipal areas. So you have to use a combination of the two when you are working with developing your representation of demand. And then the final column is pump storage. So we are lucky that now more models that have been developed in the past are providing the data on power plants, where are they located. There's been an accumulation of data in the past. This data has been closed source. It's been really difficult to get access to this data, but now they are making it more readily accessible. And one of the data sets that's come out recently is the distribution, the spatial distribution of pump storage. And this is sort of what I depict in the last column. It's showing you where are these pump storage located. And it's important to note here that these colors are not relatable when you switch rows. So it doesn't mean that because this is dark red, it's the same as up here. Actually, in Norway, this is a lot higher in potential than in Spain or in the Balkan regions. But it's just to show you that within those regions, where are the potential for storage? Even in the Balkans, there's quite a bit of potential. In Greece, you have potential in the Alps, in addition to the large storage potentials in Norway. So now that we understand where all our components are spatially distributed, we can sort of build our energy system model and analyze what insights can we capture from their sort of placements. And it's also important when you are developing your model to understand how your scope, for example, affects your results. So if you decide to focus on a region, if you include certain countries. So in this example, these results all represent Germany. So the energy mix of Germany, if we went to 100% renewables with some storage, and this actually includes some heat demand. So in the first column, you have some countries that are interconnected with Germany, that have some resources available that Germany can tap into, especially I think the biggest impact here is the fact that Norway is interconnected with Germany. So what this results into is that you have some offshore wind and onshore wind that is the biggest component in renewable energy. But what happens here is that Germany is using the storage capacity of Norway to balance out its energy demand with the demand in heat and solar and in electricity. And in the other ones, the two columns after that, there is no access to Norway. So you require a large amount of storage capacity, and in this case also transmission grids that are represented here, to balance out this mismatch in demand and supply. And and there's another comparison that I make. If we were to also better understand how these areas have in energy demand and supply, and you aggregate these regions according to that, to these attributes, you can even change your results slightly just by changing the configurations of how you aggregate these areas together. So if you see these two columns here, you can see there's a difference in the way these areas have been compiled together, aggregated the data, and this will result in new results. And this is exactly what I depict here. Just by understanding where your your solar and wind potentials are, where your energy demand is, and where the pump storage are within a specific country. The method you choose to aggregate this data together can result in new regions. For example, if you decide to aggregate all these areas here together, you can have a better representation of a region instead of maybe separating two areas and then leaving out. So this is somewhat of a new development, understanding how we aggregate areas and what the impacts of that is on the energy system modeling. So what I did in my publication, I very much looked into this in more detail. I did an analysis of how you can aggregate data, and a method that I developed, and I combine attributes of energy demand, energy supply, and storage together to aggregate areas. And I could see that by doing this, I could better capture the transmission capacity expansion needs, and I could also better capture the representation of solar and wind potential. And this is, the results were significant because I could replicate it for multiple countries, although it was more significant in Germany, because Germany, there is quite a variation, especially in solar demand and wind demand across the country. In the northern areas, you have more wind than in the southern areas, and your demand is also more located in the southern areas than in the northern areas. So working with a lot of data, spatial data, temporal, with high temporal resolution, it's important to structure them in a way that people can access it easily, can change it. So I developed a method to do that, and I focus on data processing. I won't go too much into this, but this is a work that I'm still doing, and I wanted to say a few words about it. And I developed a two-step method. This two-step method has been documented on how to standardize your indices and your data, and how to define regions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now, another aspect of the modeling is dealt with by Xiaoming Khan. Xiaoming is at Chalmers University. He's one of our ESRs there, and he will tell us about assumption of variable renewable energy resources, system boundaries, and demand patterns for energy system models. So other sides of the models which are important to look at and to really get the full picture. Xiaoming, please.
Thank you, Olaf. Oh, bit fast. So, morning everyone. I'm ESR 3 Xiaoming. Today I will talk a little bit about the impact of system boundary on modeling results, and following the general topic of package 1 is my first research question. In Sweden, there is an ongoing debate about nuclear power. So in the current Swedish electricity system, there is around 9 gigawatt-hour of nuclear power, which produces roughly 40% of the annual electricity in Sweden. And the current nuclear fleet is getting old. Decommission is planned for the coming decades. And Sweden has a policy to achieve a 100% renewable production for the electricity system by 2040. Therefore, there is a wide debate whether there would be large cost escalation if nuclear power is phased out in Sweden at last. So in this study, we try to find out what is the cost for the future low carbon electricity system in Sweden if nuclear power is not part of the generation option. So this is a general research question for my study. And within this study, we have two technical setups, which is the land deployment factor and also the system boundary. So I will first introduce you the impact of system boundary. So when we try to look at the studies in the literature, we find that a lot of studies investigating the nuclear policy in Sweden, they look at Sweden in isolation or follow historical trade pattern. This is one example. So the study of Hornet et al., they look at Sweden, and Sweden will follow the historical trade pattern. In this case, they found out if nuclear power is not part of the future electricity capacity mix, then 160 gigawatt wind capacity is needed for the system. And correspondingly, the system cost will be 6 times as much as the current cost. From this, we see that no nuclear, large cost escalation. However, we realize that they have some setup. They have a setup which might underestimate the impact of electricity trade. So in our case, we try to extend the system boundary from Sweden to the whole Europe. And we have several scenarios. In the base scenarios, Sweden has the current transmission capacity connected to all the European countries. And also the transmission capacity can be further expanded optimally. So this is the setup of our study. With this setup, we find a problem. So if you look at Sweden alone, or if you look at Europe in total alone, it's easy to represent the system cost. You have the investment cost. But if we have an interconnected system, we have a problem because, let's say here is the example. Country A has good renewable resources. Country B has high demand. Country A and country B are connected with transmission grids. In this case, if we optimize the system, we find that country A has lots of investment for wind, and country B cost only. Country A will have high investment cost, and country B will have low investment cost. Can you say, in this case, country A has a low system cost, country B, in this case, can you say country A has a high system cost, and country B has a low system cost? You can't, because country A will sell electricity to country B and receive lots of revenues, and the country B has to pay for the imported electricity. So how should we solve this problem? We introduced a new term, which is called nodal net average system cost. This new term not only considers the investment cost for generation capacity, storage, and transmission grids, we also consider the potential revenue from electricity export and the cost of electricity import. So this is our new method to measure the net system cost for a single country in the interconnected electricity system. And based on this term, we'll see some results. And first, let's look at the scenarios for this study. So in our study, Sweden may reinvest in nuclear power if the older ones are decommissioned. But the capacity is upper limited to the current value. And we have 4 scenarios, depending on the extension of transmission grids or the availability of nuclear power. So in the first scenario, where transmission capacity is kept at a current value, there is no nuclear. And then in the second scenario, current transmission capacity, nuclear is one of the generation option. And in the third scenario, transmission capacity can be optimally expanded, but no nuclear. And in the last scenario, nuclear is part of the option. So these are our base scenarios, and we will try to see the results. So this is the results for the nodal net average system cost. So first, let's look at the case where transmission capacity is kept to the current value. In this case, we find that if nuclear power is part of the generation option in Sweden, the system cost reduced by 3%. And if the transmission capacity is optimally expanded, then the system cost reduced by 4%. From this, we can see that with current transmission capacity or expanding the current transmission capacity, the role of nuclear power in Sweden in reducing system cost is rather limited. It's lower than 4%. And this is the energy mix. So again, we first look at the case when transmission capacity is fixed at the current value. And here in this figure, different color represent different technology. Yellow for solar, green for wind, and orange for nuclear, red for biomass, and the dark blue one for hydro, light blue one for electricity trade. So in the case where transmission capacity is fixed to the current value, we see there is 25 terawatt-hour nuclear energy generated in Sweden. And in the case of optimal transmission expansion, this value is much larger. And we find that in the case where transmission capacity is fixed, Sweden is a net electricity importer. So in this case, the investment for nuclear power is mainly for domestic supply. And in the optimal transmission case, Sweden is a net exporter. And when nuclear power is the option, this can help Sweden to have more export. So this is our results. From this, we can see expanding transmission grids how may affect the capacity mix, energy mix, and also the potential role of import-export for Sweden. And we are also interested in the case if Sweden is isolated. So in the case Sweden is isolated, we can find that Sweden has more wind energy generated as compared with the case there is transmission connection. And from this figure, we can see the expansion of system boundary would affect the capacity mix for Sweden. And also, we see the difference in nuclear energy generated in Sweden. And we are also interested in the system cost for Europe. So again, we look at the four base scenarios: current transmission, optimal transmission, with without nuclear power. So we can see that if nuclear power is an option for Sweden, the impact on the average system cost for Europe is very, very minor. It's almost zero, and I can show you the value. So in both cases, the impact is less than 1%. So we see there is certain impact for Sweden, which is around 3 or 4%, but for Europe in total, the system cost changes very little if nuclear power is not part of Sweden. So from this, we can see the general impact of system boundary on the modeling results. Now I talk a little bit about the land deployment factor. So as you guys already mentioned, we have lots of wind and solar in the North Sea region, but we cannot allocate them to every corner, and we have other use for the land and also for the offshore area. But for energy modeling studies, still the land deployment factor is a very important setup or assumption as input to the model. So how should we handle this? So here is a typical example of the available land for wind in Europe. So in this map, we can see a different type of land. So there is the bad type of land. You cannot allocate wind turbines. The red color represents the area with high population density, and the purple color represents the area which is protected. Nature reserve, historical places, you cannot locate wind turbines, and the green parts is the faraway areas, which you cannot have the grid access. And the light blue part is a place you can allocate a wind turbine. However, even for this available land, you cannot put a wind turbine in every corner. So one important assumption is the available land, the percentage of available land you can locate a wind turbine, which is called the land deployment factor. Some colleagues of my group, they investigated some historical data for different countries, US, Denmark, Germany, and Sweden. They find that most of the communities, municipalities, or counties allocate the land to an area lower than 10% of their available land. So in my study, I assumed 8% of the suitable land for the allocation of wind turbine. So this is our best assumption, and I will show you something, the results I play around with. So for the base case, we have 8% of land available for wind. This is our base result. You already saw that. So if nuclear power is allowed for Sweden, it may reduce the system cost by 3 or 4%. However, if we double the available land, so let's say more land for wind and solar, in this case we see that the economic benefits of nuclear power is almost zero. So in this case, we can see that if you have more assumption or liberal assumption for the available land for wind and solar, it may favor more wind and solar in the system. then in this case, the role of nuclear power is very minor. So this is some results I want to show to you. And here is my simple conclusion. So first, I want to investigate the economic benefits of including nuclear power in Sweden. And we found that the economic rationale for Sweden as a country to reinvest in nuclear power after the decommissioning of the old ones is relatively minor, which is lower than 3 or 4%. And I also investigated the impact of system boundary, and I found that with different levels of system boundary, it may affect our modeling results, especially the capacity mix. From this, we understand as a modeler, when we want to invest a new research question, we need to carefully make our assumptions about the system boundary, so which area you want to investigate. And we also look at the impact of land deployment factor, and we found that liberal assumptions for available land may favor more wind and solar for renewable electricity system. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Xiaoming. That was quite a nice example of how to use things, and certainly a starting point. And we will start with Rafael Martinez-Gordon. Rafael is actually at the University of Groningen, and he's doing his PhD there on system integration aspects. And again, as we're in the modeling session, he's a modeler, and he will tell us about modeling a highly decarbonized North Sea energy system in 2050. Rafael, please.
That is right. Thank you for the presentation, and yeah, also hi to the ones joining online. Is the audio working fine? Can you listen? Yeah? Okay. So yeah, my presentation is modeling the whole North Sea energy system, which is quite a wide topic, so I will try to compress it in 15 minutes. Just first a brief overview of the research that I've been carrying on during these last 3 years. That's basically the overview of the whole thesis. We did also some spatial resolution research in the first year. But on the last 2 years, we focused more on the modeling part. We developed an energy system model for the whole North Sea region, and we did, in this last month, some case studies related to the whole decarbonization of the whole North Sea region and some offshore wind and hydrogen interactions. So due to the time limitations of this session, that's only 15 minutes, I will focus on this part, because my colleagues already did an excellent job of the spatial resolution part. So yeah, I will briefly explain this new energy model that we developed in this last year, and I will give some short results of a case study that we recently finished. So yeah, just to start with this, well, this ESINS is the name of this model that we developed, and yeah, the first question is why another energy model, because as the ones working on the topic know, there's plenty of different energy models, power system models, heat models, energy system models. Why we need another one? And well, it can be justified because the North Sea is a very particular region with a lot of special aspects. First, as we saw before, it has a very busy maritime area with a lot of different activities, a large oil and gas infrastructure deployed, and a lot of active oil and gas extraction. It's highly populated around, and related to that, it's also a very energy-intensive region. Also, there are many different industrial clusters around in Netherlands, Germany, in most of the countries. It's highly interconnected in terms of energy and also in terms of economy. There's a lot of imports, exports, and dynamics between countries. And as we all know, offshore wind is expected to play a major role with huge projections and huge plans for 300 gigawatts in the future or even more. So these kind of features require specific modeling wishes, so to say. So we have multiple spatial claims, as we said before and in other presentations. This deserves high spatial resolution in order to account for all these different activities that can take place. We expect a large deployment of intermittency in terms of offshore wind, solar, etc. So in order to model that, it will be desirable to have hourly temporal resolution. And of course, there's a lot of interaction between energy sectors with sector coupling and many different sectors that will be totally related to each other. So of course, high sectoral coverage is also in the wish list. And yeah, if we try to make it perfect, there's also a high interaction between countries. So having this high geographical coverage, it's also desired. But of course, that's a very big wish list, and it's difficult to pack this in an energy model. But that's what we tried to do with this ESA-NS model, which stands for Integrated Energy System Analysis for the North Sea region. It's not a very original name. And yeah, it's important to mention this model was not built from scratch. We had a very, very good starting point, which was the ESA-OP model. It was developed by 2 colleagues in Rug, which was focused on the whole energy system of the Netherlands. And it's already published, and there are some case studies on that. So what we basically did was we took this very nice starting point and we enhanced it to cover the whole energy system of the North Sea region. So yeah, we have only 15 minutes, so I won't go deep into detail into most of the technical specifications of the model, but just some brief characteristics in a nutshell. The ESA model is a cost optimization model. It minimizes this objective function, which basically includes investment cost, fixed and variable operation costs, and retrofitting costs. That's typical objective function of these wide integrated energy system models. It's written as an LP, as a linear program, which makes it manageable, so it can be run in decent times. Otherwise, this model with a mixed integer or with a more complex formulation would be impossible to run. And it's important to mention it has a complete sectoral coverage of the 7 North Sea countries that we all know. That means that all the greenhouse gas emissions of these countries are taken into account when we do the optimization runs. Another important aspect is that the offshore region, so the North Sea, can be regionalized in as many regions as we want. So the spatial resolution can be tailor-made and customized for any case study. So we can play with it depending on what do we want to analyze. And yeah, just a brief summary of the geographical coverage. We cover the power network of the whole Europe. So the 7 North Sea countries are fully represented. The rest of Europe only includes power, so we can account also for trades of electricity. We also have a natural gas network, a bit more simplified, with some LNG harbors and export and import gas hubs, mainly from Russia and North Africa. And yeah, as I said, the offshore region of the North Sea can be regionalized. For the case study that I will present, we used this kind of political regions, but it could be tailor-made for different case studies. Okay, so that's it. That was the model definition. I will now move to the case study that we just finished, in which we modeled 2050 with high decarbonization targets. This was a joint work with colleagues from the University of Groningen and TNO as well, and it's under review now in Advances in Applied Energy. So I will briefly summarize the scenarios that we used and some small results. And in case anyone is interested, there's also a preprint, so I can distribute it. We can discuss some results later, because now we don't have time to dig into much detail. Well, that's a bit obvious, but what's the trigger is that the North Sea region aims to be carbon neutral in 2050, in line with the Green Deal. And in the last 20 years, we have had a very nice decarbonization slope, but of course this pace is, as we know, not enough. We need to speed it up, because if we keep this trend, we won't make it to 2030 and 2050. So that was one of the main triggers of this study. And we started building a reference scenario, which most of the data we used came from the JRC scenarios. And yeah, here, I don't know if you can see it properly, but those are mainly industry indicators and activity volumes. So you can see that this scenario assumes a bit of business as usual growth. So the economy grows around 2% GDP, I think, per year. And most industry volumes, electricity demands are increasing as well. There's also a bit of increase in energy efficiency. So heat demand is a bit lower in 2050. But the rest of indicators, also transport, go high. So that's kind of the business as usual scenario with net zero mitigation ambitions. And from this scenario, we derived 6 more using modifying different parameters, mainly biomass, which we have high and low, renewable potentials, high and low as well. In one scenario, we banned the onshore renewables, which is also something that is being discussed now, and also CCS, of course, it's also always controversial. So in one scenario, we banned it as well. So these are the 6 scenarios, a part of the reference that we use for the analysis. And the last parameter that we used to define these scenarios was, we call them mitigation ambition, because of course net zero can be reached easily or more, it can be more hard if we broaden what emissions we include in the targets. And we have here international transport and industry feedstock. Some targets do not include them because it's international transport, aviation, and navigation. It's sometimes somewhere in between, so no one wants to claim the responsibility. So we have, in some scenarios, we include them. We can consider them more ambitious. And for the low biomass and low renewables, we consider a more kind of conservative approach where international transport and feedstock for industry is not considered. So we can see a bit also the difference in the energy mix if we are a bit more ambitious or more conservative. All this said, I will present now some results from the whole North Sea in 2050 under these scenarios, and we can get some conclusions out of them. Those are the results of the primary energy. The dashed line is just dividing on the right side well, we said conservative scenarios and the most progressive ones with all the international transport covered. And yeah, I mean, the first nice conclusion is that you can see the black part is the oil. And one nice thing that we can see is that when the scenarios are more conservative, so to say, the net zero can be reached even using a large amount of oil and gas. On the right axis, you have the share of renewables. So you can see that the net zero is reached with 50% renewables and around 30–40% of fossil fuels. That's a bit unrealistic because, of course, international transport is not covered, and that's a big part. But the moment you move to more progressive targets, oil is completely banished from the energy mix. Natural gas still is a big part, but the share of renewables goes up even to 60–70%. And if CCS is banned, we see almost 93% of renewables in the mix. And yeah, you can see that the mix is mainly dominated by solar, wind, and biomass. I also have put here some supply-demand of different carriers. Here you see the liquids. And there's also here a very nice distinction. In the conservative scenarios, most of the liquids are provided via refineries. So oil is still used in refineries to provide these liquids. But when we move to more progressive scenarios, power to liquids and biorefineries are the only two sources to provide these liquids. And that's also a very big change. And yeah, end sectors are mostly aviation and industry, because those sectors, oil is very difficult to displace. And that's the main reason. We also have here natural gas. And yeah, it's interesting to see that even in very ambitious scenarios, natural gas is always there. Only when CCS is not allowed, gas doesn't enter the mix, meaning that probably even in very ambitious scenarios, natural gas will be part of the system. And it's 6 exajoules, which is a quite considerable amount. And yeah, even in the high ambition scenarios, we see that the natural gas in heat in some countries is very difficult to displace because it's very cheap. And in some countries, heat pumps are dominant, but in other countries where electricity is less easy to get, natural gas still is cost effective according to these scenarios. And there's also a little bit of natural gas reforming, because as I will show you later, hydrogen is widely used. And in some countries, there's not enough green electricity to produce hydrogen, so the system goes for a bit of natural gas reforming. Yeah, this is the electricity mix. On the left side, you have the capacity, and on the right side, the generation. And yeah, the progressive scenarios have way more generation of electricity, mainly because of hydrogen production. We will see this later. And yeah, as you can see, the solar, onshore and offshore wind are most of the mix. There's a little bit of gas in all scenarios. It's used as peak generator for some certain hours. And yeah, as you can see on the conservative scenarios, gas is quite big because the room to emit is bigger. But in the most ambitious ones, gas is almost negligible. It's very small. It's only for certain specific hours. And yeah, you might ask if the system is feasible in real time. We have hourly resolution, so the system is supply and demand are matched every hour. And yeah, the reason is that there's a lot of flexibility in the system, mainly because of hydrogen production. Electrolyzers are providing a lot of flexibility. So even with this huge intermittency that solar, wind are bringing, the system works every hour. And that's the last part, which is the hydrogen. And here is where you can see the most obvious difference between these two types of scenarios. When we have the less ambitious targets, hydrogen is negligible, it's almost not used. But if we move to most ambitious scenarios, especially if we want to decarbonize international transport and industry feedstock, hydrogen is necessary, and we have around more than 6 exajoules, which is quite considerable amount in all scenarios, especially in UK, Germany, and Netherlands. Yeah, and that shows that the importance of hydrogen to decarbonize and to provide these syn fuels and industry feedstock, it's almost compulsory, because the only alternative is biomass to provide these biofuels and biofeedstock. But of course, biomass is limited; it's not infinite. So these two, biomass and hydrogen, need to be complementary. And I don't know how much time we have left, but there are a couple of sensitivity analyses that we did, which I think are interesting enough to pay a bit of attention. In all the scenarios that we ran before, we didn't have any offshore grid concept, so all the offshore deployments were connected radially to shore. But we wanted to check if we allow some offshore interconnectors, how this will affect the offshore wind deployment. Because Netherlands and Germany, we observed that they were using all their offshore potential, but UK, because their area is way bigger, had some areas that offshore wind was not being invested. So our hypothesis was, okay, if we allow these links, maybe UK starts investing in more wind, and this is exported, and this electricity flows to countries like Netherlands or Germany, where the need of electricity is more stringent. And we did this for the two scenarios with more offshore wind, in which the offshore wind install capacity was very high, was around 300 gigawatts. You will see here. On the left side is the results of the, I don't know if you can see them, it's maybe a bit small, but the left side is the base scenario that we used in the previous runs, and the right one is what happens if we allow these additional interconnectors. And yeah, basically UK in the base case invests around 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, which is quite considerable. But if we allow these links, this number jumps to 171, so it's quite considerable addition. And in the low onshore scenario, which is even more stringent, this happens from 191 gigawatts to 388, which is a huge number. We should later check spatial availability, whatever. Those are numbers from ENSYSTRA, so in theory, these potentials are feasible. But yeah, the nice thing is that these offshore to offshore interconnectors are massively adopted by the system, around, I think, more than 100 gigawatts of HVDC. And the electricity flows to Netherlands and Germany. So this shows that allowing these offshore interconnectors and extra connectivity offshore can help to integrate more offshore wind and can be very beneficial for the system cost perspective. And yeah, that's the last sensitivity we did, was hydrogen imports, because we saw that hydrogen was widely used in the system. But in the other cases, we only produce national hydrogen. In this one, we allow for imports of hydrogen. That's the last slide and the last part. And yeah, when hydrogen can be imported under €4 per kilo, the system adopts it massively, especially in Netherlands. So this shows that if at some point this can be done, this can be also very beneficial for the system. But yeah, that opens the door to more questions, but yeah, we can discuss this later. Sorry for the time, and thank you, that was all.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. We're actually starting with the hybrid character of the conference, and we have the first online contribution by Nasimul Islam Maruf. Maruf is actually a PhD student at our university in Flensburg as well, and Maruf will tell us about one special thing. Modeling, yes, but it's modeling with open source, so that's important for looking into the details of what is inside the model, that you can understand why you derive certain results. Maruf will tell us about open models for highly renewable-based energy systems within the sector-coupled networks for the North Sea region. I hope, Maruf, you can hear me, and you have not quite the floor, but the screen in this case. Maruf, please.
Yes, I can hear. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you very much, Olaf. So Rafa was talking about the energy system models from a very continental perspective, and here I'm going to present open models, but from a sector coupled and also from the national and subnational perspectives. Hello, and I welcome you all to my presentation. My name is Nasimul Maruf, and I am from European University at Flensburg, Germany, and I'm also working at Fraunhofer ISE in Germany right now. Well, talking about models, you cannot predict the future, but you can model them and show the pathways, right? So this is what we did in the ENSYSTRA project, and I will try to show you some models I have worked on. First of all, the research question. So I did a thorough background study on sector coupling with a focus on the North Sea region from an energy system modeling perspective. I could identify that it is imperative to develop novel methodologies using comprehensive open modeling techniques and also applying cross-sectoral holistic approaches to analyze and investigate policy-relevant research questions for future highly renewable and sector-coupled energy systems. And also I identified that the methods should address both aggregated and disaggregated energy systems because the subnational energy systems, they are often ignored. So it should range from subnational to national levels, and the openness of the model should enable the model users to use, modify, and upgrade the model for performing basic to advanced level of energy system analysis. So here are the research questions. Well, there are more, but I have just addressed two here. One is which state-of-the-art tools that are accessible to model the sector coupled energy systems, or you can say how you can actually choose an appropriate tool based on a specific rationales. And the most important, how to develop the methodologies for building open models for highly renewable energy systems in the North Sea countries. So how to utilize the models to investigate the policy relevant research questions from both subnational and national perspectives. And then we have because of the high essentiality for the open science required by the global energy system transition, I chose the idea of the open energy modeling to consider as the key criterion of the research. And then I did a preliminary list of state-of-the-art energy system models, combining some old researches. So I found like there are 80 plus state-of-the-art energy system models, but how many of them are open or free for academic use? There are 59. And then I selected some rationales for our North Sea case. And these rationales are like it should have open modeling, renewable energy provision for maximum components, sector coupling provisions. For example, it should have the heat and transport sector coupling provisions, energy storage provisions, and it should have the adaptability of different geographies. And it should have it should be able to do modeling of different time horizons and also a little bit of grid modeling if possible. So with this rationales, the updated list of the open models, it narrowed down to 16, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. Yep. So I selected 16 models. I'm not saying that you have to select one of those models from this list, but I selected these from my rationales for this research, and I found so out of these 16, I also figured that there should be more rationales. For example, apart from the last 7, it should have, for example, net transfer capacity, top-down and bottom-up approach, etc. And based on that, I found out that I can use 2 tools. One is a PIPESA model, and another is a WMOF. So out of these 2, I used WMOF for the open modeling techniques. And yeah, WMOF can actually significantly contribute to open science through its free and open software, collaborative development, and modular structural representation. And yeah, an investigation into the details of the WMOF and its application and usage suggests that it can include all the conventional and renewable generations of the North Sea energy system. But I also wanted it to be simpler, like it should have at least 2 levels, like a simple user can use it and model and see what happens in the energy system. So there is one option in WMOF, which is called WMOF Tabular. It is an interface to instantiate energy system models from tabular data sources based on the WMOF soft library. And the simple tabular data structure can be used for large energy system models, leveraging functionalities of the already widely used WMOF solve library. So in the figure left, you can see the concept of the WMOF network. There are sources, there are sinks and resource buses. For example, a source can be a PV or wind, and the sink can be electricity or heat load, and the buses can be electricity, heat, etc. And on the right side, you can see the example of heat pump modeling using Wim tabular. So you can see that you do not have to go into the details of Wim, but you can just use it from the tabular version, and you can provide your information, for example, different types of costs and where, from which bus it is coming from, to which bus it is going, etc. This kind of information. So in this way, you can do simplified modeling. And following that, I developed a model which is called Open Sector Coupled Energy Model, or SHEAM. And yeah, the models, you can see that there are different volatile components such as onshore wind, offshore wind, solar PV, hydro run of the reefer plants. And for example, the fuel input of the CHP plant, it comes from the biomass resources. And in addition to CHPs, there are two types of heat pumps, air source and ground source heat pumps. There are storage options such as a pumped hydro storage, lithium-ion battery, vanadium redox flow battery, hydrogen, and adiabatic compressed air energy storage. Also, I explored a heat storage option, thermal energy storage using the hot water tanks. Well, the next part, I want to show you two case studies I did after developing the model. I'm not going into details of the model. It's a cost optimization model. And first, I selected a subnational region, which is Schleswig-Holstein in Germany. And here you can see some of the results. Well, Schleswig-Holstein is special because of its geographical conditions, because it has a lot of wind energy, and in Germany, it can actually provide a lot of wind energy to its neighboring areas. So, and also besides the biomass is one of the most significant shares. It has like 32.5% of share in Schleswig-Holstein, and it has the geological surface is suitable for storing large energy carriers such as hydrogen, synthetic methane, potential energy, thermal energy, etc. And in theory, the porous geological layers and the cavities in the subsurface can be used for storage as well, which is good for the CIES. So the OSHI model, it analyzes the Schleswig-Holstein system for three different scenarios. I call it beam 25, 50, and 100, so depending upon different biomass penetrations. And yeah, the results, if I summarize, I found that onshore wind is invested to the maximum potential in one of the scenarios. However, with increasing biomass penetration into the energy mix, we can see that the investment is not needed. And yeah, no additional offshore wind investment was needed in Schleswig-Holstein because it already had a lot of installed there. So we can easily export from that region to the other regions. Solar PV investment is maximum for the low biomass scenarios and minimum is in the high biomass scenario. Due to the cogeneration in a power heat coupled network, high biomass availability leads to increased investment in biomass-based CHPs. And also about heat pumps, high cost ground source heat pumps investment decreases in the scenario, and the low cost air source heat pump investment increases when the CHPs increases. And electricity storages, if we look at it, they're used up to their maximum potential, except for hydrogen, which is used only in the low biomass scenario. And yeah, the use of hydrogen as an alternative storage is correlated with high cost volatile generator investments. The higher the volatile electricity, the greater the need for additional alternative storage. And yeah, thermal energy storage needs are the highest when the biomass availability is limited, indicating its maximum usage with high power to heat penetration into the system. I'm going into the next slide, which is a case study of Germany. And yep, in the German case study, you can see that I replicated the model and I analyzed the northern and southern Germany. And I analyzed it for three scenarios, namely base, conservative, and progressive. And the figures show the comparison of the energy mix results for the different scenarios. The total electricity generation in the base scenario is around 900, and it increases in the conservative and decreases in the progressive scenario to 800 around. And the progressive scenario yields a reduced heat generation with less heat demand. And the I compared these results of this base and progressive scenario mix with a Fraunhofer ESA study, and it showed that like the ESA study showed that an 85% system is possible, but my model suggested that the remaining 15% is also possible with biomass-based CHVs, for example. But the system needs high electrification of the heating sector. This brings me to some final remarks. Yes, well, the good things, the model is novel and unique for the following reasons: that you can modify in 2 levels, the basic mode and the developer mode. It allows the creation of different scenarios. You can couple heat pumps with heat storages as dispatchable loads. And it's an open source model, which is definitely beneficial. It offers different storage provisions, and it considers different biomass potentials as well, from forest residues, livestock, agricultural residues, etc. And also, I claim that it is the first to analyze between northern and southern Germany, which is a very interesting topic in Germany right now. Other than that, yeah, there are some limitations as well. For example, I didn't do any transmission modeling. It was very simple. And I didn't consider the industrial heating demand. I didn't consider some of the renewable heating technologies. And yeah, there are possibility to include other storages and interconnection with neighboring countries. So all these things will update the model, and it will be better for the modelers or the users. Yeah, this was the last slide. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Maruf, and this worked fine. Justus actually is stepping in for Ingrid Nestle. Ingrid Nestle, we asked for, she's has been energy spokesman for the Green Party in the German Parliament. She's been Secretary for Energy in Schleswig-Holstein, but we have national elections next Sunday, so a member of parliament is not available. Therefore, the policy advisor to Ingrid, Justus, stepped in, and Justus will give us the policy perspective on our question. Justus will tell us about the future of the North Sea region as a critical renewable energy hub for a sustainable energy Europe from the policymaker perspective. I hope, Justus, you hear me quite well, and you have the screen now.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
We hear you loud and clear.
That's great. Okay, thanks a lot. I got in a little hurry here because I had to switch from my private PC to a tablet. But now I'm here. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for all these very interesting insights this morning. This is always so nice when we can go from the policy high-level discussion into a deep dive and listen to you guys from the science. I sent my best regards from Ingrid. She is in Schleswig-Holstein today campaigning. And please excuse maybe if I switch sometimes in my speed into campaign mode, because that's what we do right now. Quick word to myself. I also wrote my master thesis in Flensburg on pump hydro storage and the interconnection to Germany with Olaf. Then I worked 2 years for the Federal Ministry for Energy and Economics, and I was part of the North Sea Offshore Initiative there. And then I switched to the Parliament to work with Ingrid, and I have been on parental leave for the last 6 months. So this is my first speak, and it's nice to be back. So you already see my first slide. I think for you this is pretty obviously offshore wind. Why? It's not just pure climate from a policy perspective, and also especially for the Green Party, we want to focus other points, and this is definitely the strengthening of security of supply if we phase out coal and nuclear. It will lower the costs of our energy vendor drastically, and we have very high socioeconomic benefits. Right now, for example, we're discussing in the old lignite and brown coal regions, how we can make a change there. What can we do? And actually, we try to bring workforce into the offshore business. Yeah, yeah, bringing them up to the coast and work in new businesses also in the universities there for the folks. Okay. So now, why don't I'm in the second slide? Ah, there it is. You changed the slides for me, maybe? I don't know. The current status of offshore in Germany is too low, of course. We have nearly 8 gigawatt installed capacity. We have plus 3 gigawatt awarded. They will be constructed until 2026. And the government target for 2030 is 20 gigawatts. We have a need of 70 gigawatts in 2050. And we have seen in the last time a lot of 0-cent auctions. Right now, this means we need to install 1.7 giga per year until 2027, and that's fixed in the pipeline. But if we want to reach our target, we will need to speed up, and I will talk about this a little later too. As you have shown in your presentations as well, the main obstacles are the context in the spatial planning in the exclusive economic zones, and also that newly tendered offshore wind farms right now need sometimes up to 10 years, but 6 to 8 years is a planning horizon, and we are running out of time. So we have an urgent need to speed those processes up. I mean, also on land, of course, you all know this, that we need way too much time, but we need to speed up offshore as well. I brought you a slide what this basically means for Germany. In 2050 or 2045, if we go by the new target, that's a little older graph, we need 70 gigawatts of wind offshore. Sorry that the slide is in Germany, it's from Agora Energiewende. This is a substantial amount. When you look at the produced electricity with 254 terawatt hours, so nearly the same than the offshore production and the photovoltaic production due to the high full load hours. This means that we need cumulated installed capacity per year of around 4.5 gigawatt. And as I said before, right now we're on a path of not even 2 gigawatt. We need to speed up again. During my time at the North Sea Offshore Initiative, I was working in the group was called Support Group 3, and we looked on how to align the tenders and stuff, and we also looked what are the plans for the different countries, and we did this projection by that time, and we ended up with not even 70 gigawatts for all Europe. And as you also can see, this is the old German number of 15 gigawatts. We're now at 20 gigawatts in Germany. So everyone grows their targets a little, but still it's not sufficient on the one hand. On the other hand, it's very important to align all these tenders to make sure that there is enough competition in the tenders and also enough building capacity to do this. As I said, we need to speed up. And what I mean by that in numbers is that we need, after the election, set new targets. We need to, if it's even possible, because of the building capacities, we need to go up to 25 gigawatts in 2030, 35 gigawatts in 2035, which is actually our goal from the Green Party, and then even up to 60 gigawatts in 2040 and 70 gigawatts in 2045, because we have to be 5 years faster by now. How do we do this? We have to create sufficient space for offshore wind farms. So we have to look into the spatial planning. We have to strengthen the workforce in the Bundesamt for Hydrography. And we need an ongoing update of the spatial planning. And for that, we need to solve conflicts with other parties like military, shipping, fisheries. And I know from Flensburg, for example, that there was a guy I was living with in his master thesis who was looking into collusion from shipping vessels with offshore wind farms. So people working on this and the shipping industry found that they actually can improve their fishing yields by wind farms, because the little fish will go and hatch their babies. So I don't know who's talking to the military, but there's a lot of work to do, and this is one of the first steps how to accelerate all this. This is on the spatial planning, and the second point, especially in Germany, is the grid expansion. We need to speed up this. We need to build simultaneously the offshore parks to the grids, especially when we talk about joint projects or hybrid projects as perceived from the European Union. I quickly look at the time. So this. And the last point, especially for the first 100 years, we have already started this with the last presidency, EU presidency from Germany, is that we have to speak from Germany with the Netherlands and Denmark and start negotiations about joint offshore projects. And this is something which also can be done in the first 100 days. So to make the urgent need, to account for the urgent needs. When you look into our policy paper from the Green Party, which we have been published this year, I stated before, 35 gigawatts until 2035 is what we need. We said that we want to finance this with contracts for difference. I know there's a lot of PPA discussions, but we found that contracts for difference are the best way to do it, to lower financing costs. I'm happy to discuss this also with you, especially in the last half year. We saw a rise in the electricity prices, so maybe we had a new point of the discussion, but this was the point of discussion like half a year ago. Auctions, of course, are the default support mechanism. I stated this before, we need to align this on a European level. This is very important in order to reach the targets. As a Green Party, we always state that we do this only in respect of the ecological capacity, and we need to have a joint force there, and it's not working if we are saying we have to do it this way and exactly this way. And I think we have a very good discussion with the NGOs, with BirdLife International and BUND in Germany. And I said before, we want to expand the workforce in the German authorities. From EU policy level, the focus on the German presidency in the North Sea Energy Cooperation was on these joint offshore and hybrid projects you have been talking about, and on the enabling framework. This means the grid connection line, the electricity trading, the all-over cost, the land or the sea consumption, nature conservation, all those things. And one word to the electricity trading. For us and for the future, it would be very, very interesting how this shall work out, how we do this, especially when you have all the regulations from the DG competition, and to open the interconnector capacities, to have a wholesale market. This is a discussion which probably also from your side needs to be more brought to the politicians, that we can find ways to do and to deal with this, especially for the hybrid projects. It was a quick ride through it. I leave a little more time probably for discussion and picked up some time from before. In summary, we have a huge, enormous potential. The EU stated 450 gigawatts offshore wind, and this is not including the hydrogen production. I read about the 1,000 gigawatt, which brings me to another point. For me as a policymaker, it's not completely clear what the role of offshore hydrogen will be, what part will it play. I know for Germany that we need the electricity. We say wherever we can go for pure electricity, let's go for electricity and don't produce hydrogen because of the efficiency rate. And we need the high number of full load hours, especially from offshore wind, for the time where there's no onshore wind, where there's no sun. So producing offshore hydrogen is a controversial discussion. I'm sure there are places where this is good to do and helping, but where there's a potential for an electricity line, we from the Green Party would prefer that. Yes, we leave it by that. Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Justus, and thank you for cutting a little bit your time to allow more time for discussion. And it's interesting to see how fast things have been developing, what the political ambitions now have to be to reach the targets that we need to reach due to climate change and the restrictions that we are under. So different from, you know, the ideas that the incumbent industries had just 10 years ago when Lars Audun had to fight against, you know, a lot of resistance, and others had were faced with the resistance, and everything that you put on the table right now would be looked at as sheer insanity, but it's necessity by now. I'm sure we do have a number of questions, but I would like to start with one question to Laura for the discussion round. We've seen all these demands. Everybody needs lots and lots and lots of offshore wind energy. If you look at this from your perspective, and if I recall all your maps, there's hardly any room anymore, and there were small figures on your estimates. So how does this all relate? There is a microphone coming, right there, right on time. How do you see this huge demand that may need to be realized? How can this be done, and how can we kind of reconcile things?
Thank you for the question. So first of all, from the marine planning perspective, there is a consistent drive now to implement the marine spatial plans. And those plans are integrated plans that take into account all the activities offshore, balancing interests. And I could see that most of the marine spatial plans have been prioritizing among all other activities, also the offshore wind farms and the energy projects. So there's quite a consistent drive to include this new activity and also balance its spatial interests with the other spatial activities. One important aspect that I was also mentioning in the presentation is the multi-use with other activities. So there are situations where multi-use is possible, where the safety concerns can be overcome or dealt with by collaboration between sectors, but that requires a very early stage planning and also very strong participation from all sectors, so inclusion of all actors involved. And there are good examples in the North Sea in terms of combining fisheries. But for now, they're at the lower scale or local scale, and this needs to be scaled up for also the future projects. So that could be one option.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to invite questions from the floor right now, and we would use the microphone that Laura has. Please feel free to ask to our presenters. We have a question over there.
I have a question to Christian. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. I have a question about the modeling method. And in one of your slides, you showed that if we aggregate the region differently, the result can be different. And I was just wondering, what do you think if this is a model artifact, or it's something else? And and how do we deal with this kind of issue? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Inchi, for your question. It's something that understanding the spatial aspects of models is, I think, quite a recent topic. We've been, as said before, models in the past have been closed source, so it's been difficult to understand what's been happening in these models. But now that they are more open source, more people can investigate and see what are the uncertainties of these models. And one uncertainty is the spatial aspect. How are people choosing to aggregate their data? How are we selecting? A lot of times we use satellite data to represent the amount of energy that we can produce locally. And if we aggregate places that have low yield with places that have high yield, you will get an average of the two. And depending on how if you then choose to separate these two, you could have a better understanding of areas that maybe you don't need the whole area, you just need the area with the very high yield potential. So understanding this is very important, and we have to improve our models to represent this.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Do we have other questions from the floor? Andrew, you were first. It was just pointed out you were first.
No, I would like to connect a point made in the last presentation with the question mark on the role of hydrogen. I really think that's a very important question, that there are many factors influencing that. We can look at, hey, what is now the direct growing demand of electricity next to use of hydrogen, take electrification of transport and also, for example, heat. That is a very interesting one. A quarter of a kilowatt electricity can deliver 1 kilowatt hour of heat with a heat pump. But if you do it via hydrogen, you may need 2 kilowatt hours of electricity to ultimately get the heat via hydrogen into a house. So that is a factor of 8 difference in efficiency. That's an extreme example. And then biomass has been mentioned as an uncertain factor. Little biomass, you need more synfuels. A lot of biomass, you may have more biofuels available. So this is a question to the modelers, that connecting it to the policy question and debate how much hydrogen and infrastructure and investment are we then pushing for, and how does that fit your insights in the modeling? So maybe Rafael, Christian, Xiaoming, you may all have thoughts about that, having run the models and having seen the parameters and the data.
Yeah, because also one thing I couldn't show, and that's a very good point, and I think it was mentioned before, whether we should use cables to transport electricity or having offshore hydrogen, these type of questions. And yeah, I think one of the nice outputs of this model, at least the case studies that we did, is that there's a huge need of HVDC infrastructure, and that of course is very expensive. In some runs there were 120 HVDC connection for, I don't know if Germany or Netherlands. That's a considerable investment. And there's also an infrastructure of gas that could be used for that. So maybe producing hydrogen offshore might be a bit more expensive than onshore. It requires extra investments in infrastructure, etc. But if we save the HVDC cost, we can reuse gas infrastructure. Maybe then it's more cost efficient. And those are the type of questions that having these big models to have all the aspects of the energy system included can help to answer. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the good add-ons of this type of models. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I don't think we can have multiple answers to one question, otherwise we blow the question and answer session. And I've seen Harry.
Yes, I have a question for the first speaker, for Lars, which we're going to talk about in the next session as well. So Norway as the battery of Europe, what is in it for Norway? Why would Norway want this? I can see why the rest of Europe wants it. Why would Norway want it?
You need to hand over the mic.
Well, I just think that's a question, because it's possible to build a lot of pump storage and more installation of capacity, as I told you, but it must be paid. And not only with money, but also it has more pump storage will, even if you use existing reservoirs, they will be used in another way. And the public opinion, of course, will be there. So they must see some, they must have something back. And I think it's not only building connections and building storage and capacity. It is also establishing an international market system that pays for regulating facilities. I think that's a must.
Thank you. Actually, we looked into this a little bit, and what you need to understand for Norway and the rest is the seasonality. We have a counter-seasonality of the Norwegian system and the rest in the renewables production, and it fits perfectly well. So Norway could benefit in the season when the water is low, kind of the winter. We have higher levels in the reservoirs if we combine the systems. So it's kind of a mutual benefit that we have. And of course, it's business. You can make money with this storage possibility. Now, Xiaoming, yes, please.
So I have one question for our two invited speakers. So Lars, you mentioned to share the hydro storage in Norway. This is a sense of international collaboration. And from today's presentation, I also see lots of countries such as Germany and the Netherlands are exploring the offshore wind. So there is a large plan for the future offshore wind capacity investment. But if we look at the literature, look at those European studies, you see a lot of onshore land being explored. So it's basically you explore the best size of onshore wind, and then you share resource for the whole European continent. This is two different two different perspectives. One way is to rely locally on offshore. Another way is to share the onshore wind. So from the perspective of policy or political perspective, how do you see this international collaboration for this renewable energy transition?
I don't know.
Justus?
Yes, maybe when I get the question right. The German exclusive economic zone is very small, so relying on these joint projects and international corporations. And they come with a task, and there are some questions we have to deal with. But if we focus on the physics and not on the market rules, I think this can be fruitful.
Right. Well, I think the connection possibilities, we've seen some in Rafa's presentation, are huge. If you have seen in his sensitivity analysis, if you connect the UK resource with just Germany and the Netherlands, you see how it shoots up and supplies lots and lots of energy from that large resource to two countries which have large demand but very limited offshore resources. So these connections through the North Sea are just very relevant. And on the other side, you know, if I look at Germany alone at home, it's all batteries and compressed air storage. And we just ignore the beautiful possibilities that we have in Norway, right? And utilizing the Norwegian resource in converting an existing system into a pumping system is so much cheaper than all the other options. And it's so much longer term, it's less environmental impact than anything else that you can do. So the connection gives us very, very good possibilities to benefit from each other. Lars, please.
May I?
Well, I can tell you, the last period I was CEO of Statkraft Kraftselskap. We made a study about installing pump capacity, and we had a project, but it was analyzed by Statkraft, in fact, and it was not. It doesn't paid itself because of the market is not ripe for such solutions. So in a way, there must be a benefit for those who are building regulating capacities. So, and I think with all these new variable renewables, you really need regulating resources. As you saw on one of my slides from the TradeWind project, research project, the smoothing is not enough between different areas, even in whole Western Europe. There will remain need for more regulating capacity in a way. Perhaps some can be achieved by producing hydrogen, but it's not so effective. So I don't know.
Well, I think that's one of the things that studies show very early, that hydrogen is always the inferior alternative due to the physics behind it and due to the cost. So whenever we are allowed to connect to your system, it's cheaper.
So the first speaker is Benjamin Silvester from the University of Stavanger, who's going to talk to us about exactly this conflict or complementarity between Norway and Europe, the rest of Europe. So Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, can everyone hear me and see me?
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent. Okay. Just start recording my my talk. I don't have permission to record at the moment, so okay. Okay. So everyone can hear me and see me? Okay. My name is Benjamin Silvester. I'm ESR number 14. I'm based at the University of Stavanger in Norway. And the title of my project is Policy Framework Interactions for Cross-Border Cooperation and Energy System Transitions, although it's changed a little bit as I've conducted my research. Oh, yeah, okay. So the central focus of my PhD and consequently this presentation will be the role of politics and policy in energy transitions and the barriers and constraints to cross-border cooperation and energy system transition, with a primary focus on Norway, which seems very relevant to the discussion that's emerging, and its interactions with Europe and North Sea states for primarily achieving cross-border electricity interconnection. The presentation theme I've been given is Norway versus the EU, but it's both one with conflict and also collaboration, so it could rather be Norway and the EU. Presentation content is first on the importance of the political landscape, the second on why political feasibility is important, the third on why a relational approach is key to understanding the Norwegian state, and the fourth is on what I perceive to be the disconnect between Norway, North Sea states, and the EU. The two latter parts of the presentation are a lot shorter than the first two. So my research contributes to what's been called the political turn in socio-technical transitions and energy studies. And that essentially is the recognition that policy and politics is a bit more important than has previously been given attention to. And my research focuses on developing this idea of a political landscape. A political landscape is something most of us have heard of or have a rough idea of. But it's not really something that's been given a lot of kind of a physical structure or nature. And so the political landscape is a site of negotiation and conflict where formal and informal apparatus of politics meet to interpret events and what they mean for regimes, niches, and to a large extent, other landscape actors. So the reason that it's important is because it's not really the role of scientists to tell society what should be done. And this was something that was said by the first chairman of the International Panel on Climate Change, Bert Bolin. He said that's the role of politicians and society. So it's the political landscape that plays a very significant role in interpreting what I refer to as major landscape developments like climate change, economic shocks, and pandemics, and what they mean for society, the economy, regimes, energy companies, and niches, the nascent technology, and importantly, help to decide what should be done. So one way of viewing this is to think of socio-technical systems as occurring along three levels. Now, this image is from Frank Gill's work on the multi-level perspective. At the bottom, you have niche innovations, which are small networks of actors, new technologies that are still developing. In the center, you have the socio-technical regime, established energy incumbents and companies. And at the top, you have the socio-technical landscape, which is the physical infrastructure of society and also kind of exogenous, so kind of everything else is within that. So I contribute by developing what I refer to as the political landscape and embedding this within a socio-technical view of transitions. So how does this work? You know, climate change is a landscape development. It comes and it confronts us with a whole host of different problems, but it doesn't tell us what should be done for society, or how we should interpret climate change, how we should interpret the energy transition that's required. Well, the political landscape comes in and actors and institutions within that debate and they fight, and the winners of these debates interpret some of the consequences. And the political landscape can choose to protect or expose regimes and niches to different circumstances. Equally, regime actors can react positively or negatively to these decisions and attempt to lobby and use their power and financial resources to change policymakers' minds and politicians. And equally, niches are impacted by the decisions made by this political landscape. They can also react positively or negatively, but they don't have as much power as regimes. So why is this important to Norway and its interconnection with North Sea states in Europe? Well, Norway is still still interpreting what climate change means and the consequence it has for its economy and society. And so currently there's a tremendous reluctance to move away from oil and gas. It's actually pushing gas as a transition fuel. But this is being challenged within the political landscape, and there are significant conflicts brewing within it. And it's starting to fight over electricity resources now. And the axis of divide is a battle over domestic versus cross-border electricity resources. About 80% of the debate is on domestic utilization. Cross-border isn't such a large part of the debate within the political landscape at the moment, but it is starting to be. And it's important to understand that the reason why this political landscape is important is because the Norwegian state has a monopoly over hydropower transmission and most generation sites in Norway. So the state is incredibly important in determining what happens to those resources, more so than in a number of other countries. The question remains, who will be the winners and losers in this conflict? A new election has occurred in Norway and there's a new government forming. But what's interesting, and is perhaps unfortunate, the timing for ENSYSTRA, is huge pressure is now coming to Europe. And I think this is a very interesting time for this debate about interconnection and the energy transition, because we could be entering a type of kind of winter of discontent for European power. So at the center of this discussion over energy transitions is a focus on feasibility. But there's a huge amount of focus on techno-economic feasibility as the most important determinants of transition, and not enough on the role of political feasibility. And I think the Norwegian case and others show that politics is absolutely vital to this. It is understandable. Political feasibility is incredibly difficult to engage with and measure, let alone predict. And the reason why this is a problem is there's a lot of feasibility analysis that is conducted from a techno-economic perspective. And that typically confers that technological feasibility plus economic feasibility equals that something is politically feasible. However, this is often not correct. Technology and economics are incredibly important, and they have a substantial impact on political feasibility. But political feasibility is its own thing. Just because something is very technologically efficient or cost effective does not mean that you will get the support of society, policymakers or politicians. It helps, but it is not the thing that confers that something will happen. And I think history, history is littered with many examples of this. Different transitions have different feasibility components. And so you could view the perfectly balanced kind of ideal transition as one as having equal components of feasibility. Equally, some where you have a technology that's very good, but economically it's not cost effective, politically it's not supported. Sometimes, although rare, you might have a situation where economically something makes sense, but technologically and politically it doesn't. And in other cases, something is more politically feasible than it is techno-economically feasible. Maybe CCS would be a good example of this, that is very strongly backed politically in Norway, but techno-economically is still developing. Political feasibility is about barriers and hurdles, constraints. And so to overcome these constraints, you need to satisfy multiple barriers and hurdles and get over these along different societal political lines. In the Norwegian case of installing substantially more electricity interconnectors than is currently planned to meet these decarbonisation targets, it is political feasibility that is the most lacking. And it's very difficult to see how, in the short term, these can be overcome, because they concern price concerns and the utilisation of electricity to meet domestic targets. So in the interconnector debate, the technology is already there. It can be developed further, but it's pretty well established with regards to interconnectors. Grids can develop more, can handle bigger loads, etc. But it's already pretty there. Economically, it makes sense to produce this in the macroeconomic situation in Norway, but there are significant concerns over price increases for consumers and industry. And this leads to a situation where politically unions, which are extremely powerful in Norway, and other actors are quite against a more interconnected Norway. So why is interconnection experiencing such a low level of political feasibility in Norway? Well, in order to answer this, you need to understand the Norwegian state, its model, and how the state reflects the societal economic factors within Norway and the relationships that exist within it. So a relational approach seems to be the best way to understand this. And this assumes that the state is a reflection of society, economics, and politics. In essence, it's not autonomous from society and economics that other state theories would argue. So using the following approach, I won't speak too much on this. I've identified a number of important state actors and institutions and interviewed many of them. So far, the important actors concerning electricity interconnection are various ministries, agencies, state-owned organizations and companies in Norway. What's interesting is three ministries are important in particular: the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy, and the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and the Ministry of Climate and Environment. What's interesting is these ministries appear to have very different views on interconnection and are contesting renewable energy resources for different industry interests. They represent different aspects of society. So there's a conflict brewing here, and it's beginning to emerge in Norway and beginning to come into view. Statnett, Statkraft, NVE, unions and major Norwegian power companies are also engaged in this, and they're very important. I don't have enough time to speak about them individually, but the divergence between these actors, these ministries, and these industry interests and unions is a fight over the utilization of domestic electricity resources first and foremost. And that's a fight over offshore oil platforms and electrification there, electricity for energy intensive industry, the electrification of transport such as ferries, electricity in order to meet domestic CO2 reduction targets. And this concerns primarily electricity prices. Will they go up, will they go down? And so cross-border energy trade is part of that, but it's not a huge part of the focus of the Norwegian state. And what was interesting about the talk we were given yesterday by Tata Steel was all of the different scenarios that Tata had with regards to the electricity price. Depending on if hydrogen is used or different forms of energy required in industrial processes, dramatically impact the amount of electricity that's utilized. André Faaij had the example about a factor of 8 if you're using hydrogen for domestic heating. So what the energy mix ends up being will tell us about how much electricity we need and where it should come from. Within this, there's a huge difference in the political party support in Norway. So NorthConnect was suspended, the argument that was given, due to wanting to see what NordLink and North Sea Link do to domestic electricity prices. NVE modelled that perhaps the electricity price would go up by 2 or 3 öre with NorthConnect. But that's nothing in comparison to the electricity price increases in Germany and Sweden. But it's a huge point of contention in Norway. Initially, NorthConnect was supported by several parties, but they changed their mind during the process. I spoke to some people behind NorthConnect, and the Progress Party, for example, pledged its support and then pulled out. And there are significant issues over ownership of NorthConnect. Despite the majority of the ownership of NorthConnect being Norwegian municipalities, companies like Elisa, who are municipality majority owned, there's a big difference between the state with a capital S, centralized state, and the state with a small s through communes and municipalities. And these are treated as private entities by some political actors. And so the debate is, does Statnett need to own all of these interconnectors fully? Recently, the Red Party's come out to oppose the opening of North Sea Link due to fears over high electricity prices and wants it delayed. And the Progress Party wants an even higher tax on interconnectors, even though hydro is heavily taxed today, and there's very significant rent on interconnectors. A new coalition government led by the Labour Party, the Centre Party, are unlikely to be more friendly to interconnectors than the previous Conservative coalition government based on previous record. And there's significant concerns over environmental impact on interconnectors and expanding hydro reservoirs with pumped storage, silt movement and implications for wildlife. So this leads me to begin to conclude. We know the domestic context, but when compared to Europe and North Sea states, there's a bit of a disconnect. All North Sea states either have access, want more, or want to access Norwegian electricity resources. And the European Green Deal, in order to be realised, needs to have a significant level of interconnection. And it views Norway as a key partner. But North Sea states are also starting to realise that they won't get the level of interconnection they want from Norway. Germany, for example, the informants I've spoken to there have said that they fear that they won't have access to Norway to have the sort of energy that they were hoping to have 5 or 10 years ago. UK, Denmark and Netherlands all have different understandings and ideas of what Norway can provide based on their own domestic context. But seen in the domestic context with the Norwegians, they're not so currently focused on expanding interconnection for exports to Europe over fears of electricity prices, concerns about achieving these targets. Less interconnection from Norway means these countries will have to solve their decarbonisation problems by exploring slightly different pathways, and this leads ultimately to a different energy system developing. And there's also a significant risk that Norway can lose out from not selling its energy with such uncertainty over weather conditions also. It is not as simple to say that prices will increase as a consequence of interconnection, and Norway may well need interconnection for pumped storage hydropower to fill its reservoirs after periods of no rain. So in conclusion, the political landscape is key in Norway, but it's also important in North Sea states in Europe. Some are aligned and some are not. Studying and understanding this helps to illuminate the decision-making of states and the behavior of some political actors and institutions. Political feasibility is a very important part of this equation, but the political feasibility of interconnection expanding beyond current plans is quite low in Norway. It's low because of these concerns over prices and meeting domestic targets, but I think it's also to be aware that states operate on a realist paradigm, and they have their own state imperatives to look after their own economies and society. So that's something that will have to be taken into account when we think about what energy system will develop. We know that Norway has tremendous potential to contribute to Europe's decarbonisation, but there is now a lack of projects scheduled, and there's a significant risk that this starts to fall further behind. And this disconnect is a huge part of this. And Europe and North Sea states are starting to appreciate this and look to alternate solutions. And there's a real risk of Norway, I think, losing out to other countries who are prepared to contribute more to Europe's decarbonisation. And just some final thoughts briefly. I think we need to show what happens to energy prices if there's really extreme situations with no wind or rain. And I think that will help the Norwegian case. I think we need to challenge ideas on interconnection to explain how they're beneficial to industry in the medium and long run, and also to talk about how it can't be an assumption that these prices will necessarily go up. They may well go up, but prove to lower over time. And we need a balanced approach that acknowledges concerns that's not rooted in dismissing these imperatives. And we also need to explore how to better financially compensate Norwegian operators and society for contributing to Europe. Currently, there's not enough incentives, and there's high taxes on hydropower for operators and huge rents on lines. So I hope I didn't speak so fast, but that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a brief reaction on the same theme from Arne Amot at Lisa.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me in the Netherlands and other places.
Perfect.
Okay. Interconnectors from Europe to Norway's well-regulated hydropower system plays today an important role in Northern Europe and can also play an important role in the years and decades to come. And we have to know that Norway's hydro storages is close to 50% of the total hydro storage in Europe. A significant increase in transmissions capacity between Norway and Europe is, of course, possible. Maybe a double, maybe a triple of current interconnector capacity. It's technically feasible, but there are different barriers that we have to deal with. First of all, we have to understand that the Norwegian energy system is more or less totally based on electricity for heating, for cooking, for hot water in our homes. Electricity prices in Norway is very important to more or less everyone, due to the fact that we use more electricity in our homes than anyone else on the planet. And there are also this political aspect that Benjamin talked about. There seems to be more and more people that are skeptic to more interconnectors. What will Norway actually gain having an increased interconnector capacity? What will be the environmental aspect of constructing new hydropower stations for pump or for higher installed capacity? What will be the impact on our metallurgic sector? Will new interconnectors increase the energy price in Norway significantly, making the metallurgic sector unprofitable? Different reports saying that the price effect is quite limited, but what we have seen the last year is a significant increase in energy prices. What are the environmental impacts on rapid changes in our hydro reservoirs, increased erosion in the lakes, influence on secure ice in wintertime, biodiversity, etc. And of course, we have to focus on what is the investment risk for the power companies that want to maybe make new hydro projects. But I think also that there are not only barriers, there could be possibilities. Could we have a process in Norway that is well planned and coordinated, making sure that we realize the best new hydro project first, all considerations taken into account, with a given and fixed profitability. This could reduce political risk and investment risk and giving good society for all parts involved. And this is more or less the way that the Norwegian gas field in the Northern Sea was developed and made its way to market some decades ago. Another solution is giving Norway sufficient economic profit to gain from providing new large-scale capacity services to Norway. Maybe we should have a different pricing on the interconnectors, maybe what we had some years ago at the SK4 interconnectors. So maybe there are ways forward. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen and hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And as you can see, this is a fantastic collection of presentations, and we are all very interlinked. But I will look at the market design to support the energy transitions, and I specifically looked at modeling to support decision and policy making. So we are very much aligned. My name is Andrew Kilmartin. I'm supervised by Dr. Harry van der Weyde, and I'm from the University of Edinburgh Institute for Energy Systems. And sorry. Okay, sorry, presentation overview. The ENSYSTRA project is broken into 4 work packages, and I just wanted to highlight that. I belong to work package 4, policy and market design, but we've heard from the energy system modeling work package, but we will also hear later from technologies and also from actor behavior. And you can see that's the strength of this project, is we have 15 PhD students researching all these different areas that we're all exposed to. But I focus on modeling to make good investment decisions and good policy. And my journey it's been fantastic over the last 3 years. I've looked at the Energy Union, Green Deal, looking into energy systems and how we model those, what reforms were anticipated and how we can model that. And then to look for a framework so that we can assess how are these decisions made? How do we incorporate risk and uncertainty into this decision process? But we also need to look at the policy process, as we've alluded to earlier, and how our research approach can impact this. So one of the results for me was to look at how do we start a decision dialogue and how do we implement the policy? And most importantly, at the end, I'll look at how can we work with the investment plan, the Green Deal. What are we trying to do? We are trying to provide research to support the energy transition of the future. And this schematic from Arup is an energy system of 2035, but we can see there is a drive to electrify. There's a drive for other energy carriers to introduce hydrogen at huge scales, to import energy, to export energy, which we do, but to have better control of that, to have more interconnection, but also to introduce more storage. And another area that we've also addressed in the modeling session is the sector coupling. And this will affect the demand. So we've got to look at the supply and demand of this energy system and how we interconnect across regions and other countries. So my journey started with the Energy Union and the Green Deal. And the Energy Union, we were looking at a fully integrated energy market, a low carbon energy, and we are focusing on the research to support that. And we will get some gains from efficiency initially, but as our energy requirements increase, or as energy is used, maybe additional energy for carbon capture, etc., we may lose those efficiencies, and we have to learn to balance that supply and demand. We also have to keep an eye on energy security, which is not considered within the agencies that deal with energy. To achieve the Energy Union, we set some targets. These were set in 2020 and 2030. So for gas emissions, renewable integration, getting those efficiencies, funding to support this. An area I'm focusing on is the interconnection, a target for 2020 and 2030. And also we will start to address the CO2 from transport in the future. But further to this, the Green Deal transpired. How to transform the EU's economy. And what was interesting for me, this is very much based on the Sustainable Development Goals, but for me, this was how we would finance the transition, and it would be a just transition. So we need to consider all options and opportunities on the table. And we have overachieved in some areas, or we've had to increase those targets, a stretch target. So for 2030, say for gas emissions, we've increased to 55% reduction. Fit for 55 is the campaign. Whereas the world, they're trying to set that at 45% for 2030. And we have achieved, or we've achieved our 2020 targets in most areas, and we've kept those stretch targets in most areas for 2030. But on the interconnection side, we did not achieve the target of 10% of interconnection, which is a representative capacity, generation capacity between countries. And they introduced an additional measure that by 2025, we need to achieve 70% utility of interconnectors. So that led me to think, well, are we making the right decisions? Did we scope? Did we get the decision process correct on bringing interconnectors into the energy system? So I started to look at how do they screen and approve projects and finance and look at the funding. And that brought me to the cost benefit analysis that they use for investment projects. And this was important for me so I could see from the modeling side where those results would be used and brought into the approval stage and to receive funding and to get the green light. So I had to address how do we model and what are the market designs we're trying to achieve. So I started to look across the North Sea region. We are focused between 3 countries, Norway, UK, and Netherlands, and we could look at the supply and demand in each country, the interconnection between these countries, and the storage capability and generation capacity in each of these countries. And on the right-hand side, you can see that's the gas network of the North Sea region. And that we will have different energy vectors in our energy system. So for the market reforms, they have proposed that we must help energy cross borders to decarbonize through interconnectors, that we need to integrate sustainable and renewable energy sources. We need a lot more storage to do that. And one of the key market reforms was to empower the consumers or prosumers, those who produce and consume electricity. So when we looked at the energy system modeling, the top down is predominantly associated with policy, while the bottom up is associated with technical rich detail, investment opportunities. And this is the area where I focused my research, looking at equilibrium models, but I also compared to other PhD students, their modeling approaches to see which modeling approach was most suitable. So the market modeling, we've set up some simplistic models to get some insight. We wanted to see what were the effects of interconnection and storage. What was the interaction between interconnection and storage? Did interconnectors reduce market power? Does market power exist when we introduce storage? And what investment opportunities, if we have a investment level in our modeling, what investment opportunities exist. But from a decision point of view, how is this decided? How are they screened and how are they selected? So where are our results used? So on the right-hand side from Ventosa, these are different market modeling, energy market modeling, and these are the different models that we are comparing. But I needed a framework to bring all of this together. And at first I looked at decision-making from a risk perspective, how we have informed decision makers. And then I moved into the engineering economic aspects, decision methodology of how we structure, how we set up the model and how we analyze that model. But we also can look further into opportunities for flexibility and uncertainty beyond deterministic analysis. What if we approve a project, but we do it later? We do nothing now. What's the impact of doing nothing now? And we also look at how do we reduce uncertainty? How do we pay for that extra information or to get confidence in our decision process? But I went back to the political. I'm an engineer, but I went to the political science. It's not the dark side, but I went to the political science side. And I looked at, well, how do they develop policy? What do they want? And they needed a policy process, has a cycle where they look at getting that on the agenda, the energy transition, and how we formulate a response, which was how our modeling came in, how we adopt that, how we sell that to the public, how we implement it. And that's where we'll see the projects approved or the market mechanisms introduced. But something in addition is I found this didn't address decision-making specifically. And it also, there's a plethora of research on this, on energy transitions, but we may be in danger, and this is what I refer to in Pailka, the honest broker, we may be in danger of all becoming issue advocates, and we end up having camps, and we're not making the decision based on the results, but it's more bias or overconfidence or optimism. And that's why we need to focus on becoming the honest broker of policy alternative. And I also thought, well, what if we can't achieve honest broker? How do we control it? How do we make sure we're assessing this without bias? And that brought me to bring all of these elements together. And to review this, we introduced the decision quality cycle. And decision quality would help us confirm what we're deciding, what choices are out there, what consequences do we have the right information, what consequences do we care about, are we thinking straight, will we take action? But we didn't just stop at the decision quality, which allowed us to have the review. We moved into decision dialogue, and decision dialogue allows us to take it from a significant decision level to a strategic decision level. And it helps us address the complexity, the organizational complexity with energy systems across the European Union, as well as the analytical complexity that we require to support these models.
Andrew, can you please conclude?
Yes. So that allowed me to develop a framework that looked at decision process to introduce more decision analysis. And this is similar to portfolio analysis, where we have a stakeholder board and a project team, and we could overlay a policy process into that. We could then make sure we have sufficient decision analysis when we're looking at the models and taking the results from the models into the decision process. We could also then make sure that we implement that policy and that we have a feedback loop where we can decide, is this the right project? Is this the right mechanism that we've introduced? And why? Because we have to go back to the cost-based analysis. We have to make sure we have sufficient information to make sure we've got feasible options on the table, that we assess the financial and the economic analysis, and that we get the right projects, get the right funding and the right approvals. And we need to introduce portfolio analysis, and that we update our national economic energy and climate plans, and from that, develop the 10-year national development plans, and also have penciled in 2030 and 2040, so we can get the budgets right. And why? Because we need to apply for money from the investment plan, from the Green Deal. There's $1 trillion on the table for the next 10 years. and we need to make sure the right projects are prioritized. And the decision framework that we've looked at earlier can address this. So in conclusion, if we use decision quality to review, and then we use the framework to govern this process, we can help support the cost-benefit analysis. But we must understand this is underpinned by the Green Deal and the Energy Union strategy, and the metrics and the values that entails. And if we do that, we will develop this energy system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Can I have a reaction on the theme from Professor Chris Dent from the University of Edinburgh? Who doesn't appear to be on Zoom. So Chris, if you're on the platform, you do need to join the Zoom link that you've been sent this morning. In the meantime, we will continue with Professor Reide Bradvold from the University of Stavanger.
Thank you. So I'm not going to talk about Andrew's work specifically. I'm going to focus on a couple of important questions related to his study and to his work. So Matthew talked about decision making, and decision making is the core of his work. So it's natural then to ask why this focus on decision making, and it's quite trivial, isn't it? Because it's only through our decisions that we can actually impact anything. Whatever we want to achieve, we can only achieve it through our decisions. So that's the only way we can impact ourselves, our own situation, our family, our corporation, our world, anything. So making good decisions seems to be a pretty vital skill. One element in decision making is uncertainty. So why is uncertainty important? Well, decisions by definition are about the future, aren't they? And the one thing we know for sure about the future is that we don't know how the future will evolve. We are uncertain about it. So a crucial element, not the only element by any means, but a crucial element of good decision making is to include uncertainty and to have a good understanding of the uncertainty involved. So the deterministic analysis part that Andrew was referring to is not really a very interesting aspect of decision making. And he did emphasize the probabilistic or uncertain nature of it. Andrew also talked a bit about good decisions. He had the phrase good decisions in his talk. And that sounds nice, doesn't it? But if I were to ask you, how can you know whether a decision is good or not? How can we judge the quality of a decision? What would your response be? In general, the society, in general, the society evaluates the decision maker, be it a corporate or a public policy decision maker, we tend to judge people on their results. So it's natural to assume that the good decision maker is one who makes good decisions, and that good decisions are those that produce good results. This is a dangerous assumption. When we evaluate decisions by their outcome, we often underestimate this role of uncertainty, the role of chance. So why did things really turn out the way they did? An outcome is determined in part by our choice and in part by luck. So it's a mix of skill and luck. And figuring out this balance between skill and luck on how things turn out is something that feeds also back into your beliefs. So this is essential because that's going to inform your future decisions. So understanding this balance between skill and luck is absolutely essential in improving your decision-making skills. And without a solid framework for examining your past decision, the lessons you learn from your experience will be compromised. And again, I'm not going to extend this, but the heart of the matter, of course, is that in an uncertain world, no approach can possibly guarantee success. So the question we should try to address is a more nuanced one. How much of a difference, if any, does one decision-making approach make relative to other approaches? And that is the effect of process on the quality of the decision. I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to finish up by referring to actually one of the founders, one of the initiators of decision analysis and also probability theory, Jacob Bernoulli, who made this point as early as in 1681, where he wrote that one must not decide about the value of human actions from their outcomes. And with that, I'm going to hand the word back to the host. Thank you.
The researcher speaking here is Harry Moncrief from the University of Edinburgh. Harry, go ahead. And please try to keep to your 15 minutes. I'm trying not to interrupt people because we're videoing this, but I will if I have to.
Yeah, I could probably try it. Get it a bit. See how much should be. Sorry, just need to. Share the screen. It's not. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so you can all see the screen now and hear me fine. Yeah, so, well, good morning all. Well, good morning in the UK where I am, good afternoon in other parts. So apologies for not being able to be here in person. I would have liked to, but I've got a 1-year-old child and wasn't able to get away from childcare responsibilities for the week. Now my research examines the oil and gas industry engagement and low carbon innovation systems in the North Sea region. So specifically, I look at how the oil and gas industry in the UK, Norway and the Netherlands is responding to the energy transition and to various low carbon technologies in these 3 regions, and comparing and contrasting the various responses. However, my presentation isn't going to cover any sort of specific research results or research papers. Instead, I'll focus on the theme of this session and try to come up with some sort of interesting, or stimulate some debate or some discussions around some potential conflicting opinions, or some of the sort of discussions that are going on at the moment, which are yet to be resolved. I can maybe take some of these into the plenary session. So in the session, I will focus on the 2 industries, offshore oil and gas industry and the offshore wind industry. And so the theme of the session was complementarities and conflicts. Now, I'm not going to talk about the potential complementarities between the 2 industries because I believe they are pretty well understood and well documented. There's many reports and publications out there that have looked into the synergies between the 2 industries. And this can be in terms of reusing and repurposing oil and gas assets and infrastructure, and also the transfer of skills and knowledge between the 2 industries. So I don't feel that would really add anything new to this discussion. However, what's perhaps received less attention is some of the potential, conflicting visions and divergences between the 2 industries, certain aspects of the North Sea energy system. And so that's what I've kind of focus on in this presentation. And I've chosen 3 potential conflicts or disagreements between the industry. These have been selected from my wider PhD thesis, which involved 45 interviews with industry experts in the 3 regions. These included policymakers, government regulators, oil and gas companies, renewable energy companies, research organizations, technology developers, etc. So I've basically gone into this interview data sets and sort of looked at 3 of the sort of tried to come up with some of the currently the conflicts that are happening, or the disagreements that are happening kind of between these 2 industries that are maybe kind of relevant for this theme, that have kind of emerged, which perhaps aren't kind of promoted as much in the public at the moment. So the first sort of theme regards the concept of system integration and market size. So the integration of offshore energy systems, including oil and gas, renewables, hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, is seen as a vital strategy to meet many of the North Sea region's climate targets. However, there remain certain sticking points. The first potential issue regards the scale of the power demand for oil and gas platforms as an investment opportunity for the offshore wind industry. The North Sea offshore wind industry has grown considerably over the last 10 years, and as a result, many pockets of the energy transition are simply not big enough for the wind industry to see as a suitable investment for them. For example, in the UK, It's been estimated that the power demand for the whole UK continental shelf is about 2.3 gigawatts, which is approximately just 3 wind farms. While the oil and gas industry has been promoting the potential of the wind industry to supply such power, the wind industry currently lacks a sort of commercial approach to the investments on this scale. One of the issues currently that's happening is that the pricing remains a key sticking point between the industries. The oil and gas industry have calculated that, in the UK, if the wind industry can bid in at a contract for difference, it's around £40 a megawatt hour. They should be able to supply their platforms for a similar price. Now, while this is significantly less than the cost of the power of the platforms, the costs that the oil and gas companies currently pay for the power generation, they are committed to pursuing kind of a similar price around 40 to 50, because they know that if the offshore wind companies do not connect to the grid, they pay less grid charges, in the grid charges or transmission user system charges. In the north of Scotland, where a lot of the offshore wind is, it's currently the highest in the UK, and these wind companies are direct competition of those in the east coast of England, which currently do not pay zero transmission costs. So as a result, by moving the grid transmission costs, the oil and gas industry know that they could get around 50 megawatts hour, £50 a megawatt hour. However, the offshore wind industry has also done their own sums, and they know that it's that they are currently paying significantly more. The oil and gas industry is paying significantly more for their power generation. So while they recognise that the wind industry recognise there is a demand for power from the oil and gas industry, the difference over pricing and the scalability result in a current gap between the two industries, which is yet to be resolved. As a result, currently some of the larger companies have little interest, and they need to see significant demand if they are to invest. And if these issues aren't resolved, it is likely, or many in the sector predict, that the two industries might go their separate ways, and we might not see the systems integration to the extent that is currently kind of being talked about and is mentioned in many of the visions and reports. And this could result in, for example, the oil and gas industry becoming their own suppliers of offshore wind, which is what we see happening with Equinor. And another potential solution that is being proposed as a way to kind of create this demand is to aggregate the fields, the oil and gas fields, in order to create this scale. So by aggregating many small fields together and strategically putting a wind farm there, you could perhaps get the scale that's required for an investment. However, there's two as potential issues which are kind of going to the next point. And that's another point that's emerged, is the potential reluctance of the wind industry to facilitate oil and gas extraction. Now, the use of offshore wind to power the oil and gas platforms is a concept that has been increasingly promoted by the oil and gas industry as a way to reduce its carbon emissions. However, what is not highlighted as much as the increased hydrocarbon extraction from using offshore wind to power these platforms. So, so electrification from wind farms can increase hydrogen production and revenues in three main ways. The first is by replacing the gas turbine by an electrical drive. Fuel gas that would have otherwise been used to facilitate the production process can now be sold. This increase in the total revenues of gas and taxes from electrified platforms. The increased revenues from the sale of the fuel gas are expected to outweigh the price that needs to be paid for the electricity to power the drive. Secondly, the OPEX, or operational expenditure reductions due to electrification, means that the hydrogen production can carry on from external for an extended period of time. This increased economic lifetime of the platforms could possibly lead to a higher volume that can be recovered from the fields, which will also increase total production and revenues for the North Sea countries. And then finally, because of electrification will lead to reduced carbon dioxide certificates that need to be purchased. And this will again have an overall cost reduction effect on the OPEX of the platform. Now, as a result, the oil and gas industry in the North Sea has been increasingly looking into the potential of bundling these marginal fields, also called small pools, as an opportunity to develop previously uneconomical fields by conventional methodology. Sorry about this. However, this can pose a dilemma for the wind industry, as it could increase their carbon footprint through the facilitation of greater hydrocarbon extraction. The outcome of such, and this obviously has ramifications both from the potential societal pressure on for the offshore wind companies, but also the financial pressure from green investment markets and European utilities with regards to kind of shareholder objections. Now, the outcome of such potential concerns still remains to be seen, but obviously it could have a wider impact for future energy system integrations in the North Sea. So it kind of goes on to this kind of final question is, and I think this is a question that's not really being asked at the moment, but I think it will be sort of, be increasingly asked, is that, does the increased hydrocarbon extraction from electrification outweigh potential carbon reductions from using renewable power? I think this would be a question that many will be asking themselves over the coming years. And so the third one, that is a concept that is being talked a lot about, especially in the UK and in the Netherlands. It's the potential of blue hydrogen as a transition fuel. Now, the role of blue hydrogen as a transition fuel is, just 2 seconds, just why that. The role of blue hydrogen as a transition fuel for green hydrogen is an approach that many in the oil and gas industry have been promoting. Incumbent oil and gas companies in the North Sea are making a case due in part to the potential reuse and repurposing of invested assets. However, the offshore wind industry, which has little or no investments with the potential reuse, is a bit less supporting of this this narrative. While the oil and gas industry argue that green hydrogen production is currently not to scale, the offshore wind industry also argue that neither is blue hydrogen due to the requirement for CCS, for which there is none currently at scale that is linked to the production of blue hydrogen. As a result, blue hydrogen also requires significant investment. So the wind industry are questioning, why is that investment not being made directly into green hydrogen? For example, in September 2020, the Offshore Wind Industry Council released a report which claimed a similar investment levels in electrolyzers could result, and other technologies could result in by 2030, green hydrogen would be on par with blue hydrogen. And the wind industry are, begin to highlight the significant advances that are made in cost reductions of offshore production from 160 pounds per megawatt hour to 40 megawatts per hour just in about 6 years. And certainly, we could also start to see some of these cost reductions in green hydrogen. Obviously, the cost of electricity as well is an important factor. So the industry is arguing that should we follow a path that led to rapid cost reductions, we can also see similar results in green hydrogen. And of course, these issues need to be resolved, as such uncertainty will impact investment for both blue and green hydrogen. And such uncertainty will lead to a detrimental effect of both technologies. If you're looking at sort of blue hydrogen CCS, that certainly in the UK aren't going to be operational to 2023, 2024. If you're then looking at 2030 in terms of a transition, you're not going to see the returns of the investment. So there's still, while there are a lot of publications and talking about these shared visions on the role of blue hydrogen, I think there's still a lot that needs to be resolved between this and also between some of the other points that I mentioned that will all relate to and have future ramifications over sort of the systems integration in the offshore North Sea region. And so with that, I will just end it. So there's also a number of research papers which I hope will be published on the ENSYSTRA website and database if you want to kind of look more into some of this research. And with that, I'll hand over. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We did have a final reaction planned by Sjur Bradland from Norwegian Energy Partners. I don't see. He is here. So thank you very much for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. We have had the pleasure of having Harry with us for a small year and have a lot of dialogues around these issues. My background is actually more than 20 years within the entire energy space. That means that I've been working in oil and gas, hydrogen, offshore wind, onshore wind, wave power. So I've seen a lot of these dilemmas that we have. And of course, my main task now is to show how the possibilities going forward for the entire supply industry within the energy space. That means that the traditional oil and gas suppliers, we use the terms, we will not deny anyone to be Kodak. And for those who remember Kodak that didn't recognize the new technology coming, they went bankrupt. But if they want to be a Kodak player in going forward, because they want to harvest from the technology so far, but we always need to show them the opportunity and the possibilities. That is our main task. And then the suppliers themselves have to decide where to go or not to go. First of all, I think I will warn about making a lot of conflicts. If you have a task, you should focus on that. That means that you should focus on your task and not disregard anyone else or talk anything bad about anyone else. We're talking about this discussion between green and blue hydrogen. If you are working with green hydrogen, I would focus on that and see to the cost being reduced. And then hopefully you can outbeat the blue hydrogen going forward. But today, we need the blue hydrogen to create a market so the green hydrogen can take their relevant place and the deserved place. I think that the issue that we actually have in front of us regarding the environmental side is so immense and so huge and need all the positive elements that we can use. And that's why I will be very concerned about making these conflicts larger than they are. Then it's up to the policymakers to be honest about their goals and the means they're going to use and give the industry a chance to transform if that is what's going on. I've been working with a politician for so many years, and a lot of times they have said things which not have been executed or done. And that means that we as an industry have jumped into some markets, areas where the policymakers then are retracting from afterwards when they see the consequence of what they are doing. So believing in silver bullets or picking winners in the long term, that is actually a very tricky task to do. So the policymakers need to make support the market. CO2 regime is a very good way to tell someone that you will have these costs and these costs will increase. How do you prepare yourself for that? But of course, to single out Europe as a single market, then meeting the competition from Asia and other places, that's of course a big consequence of having a CO2 market in Norway. Regarding your 3 points you made, I think this market size, I think you will have a lot of players that would be interested in going into smaller projects, maybe because they don't have the long-term experience. Maybe they want to prove their ability to make projects. But of course, the oil and gas industry need them to pay the relevant price. So it's attractive for the players to go into there with their projects. Hywind Tampen is a very good example where they want to prove the concept in a larger scale. That's a scale of project for floating industry, which is of interest to the oil and gas industry and also to the supply industry. So I think you should be able to find commercial terms that will make it interested for a lot of players to go in there. Reluctance of the offshore wind industry to facilitate hydrocarbon extraction. I think we have to recognize that in the short term, maybe also in the long term, we still will have a lot of oil and gas going forward. And then the question is, what do you do with that? Do you deny the existing, or do you try to reduce the CO2 footprint? in that task. So I think you should see that as a, you can decide whatever term you would like to use, but I think you have to see that the oil and gas industry will continue for some years, and then the future will tell when this will go to stop. And back again to this blue and green hydrogen, I don't think you should see that as a threat to your, if you are working with green, but you should see it as a possibility to build up a market until the cost of green hydrogen has reached the level of blue hydrogen. And of course, the cost will also change due to the CO2 cost that will be put on the blue hydrogen going forward, and also maybe requirement for CCUS. And then you will find a different cost level going forward. But I think to increase the market and build out the market is very important also for the green hydrogen. So I will see it's no opposition between green and blue, but the timing is maybe different, and your belief on going forward, that's what you need to focus on, and we'll see. I think that was some few comments from me, and congratulations to you, Harry, for this task. And I think it's very important that we see how we can show the possibilities going forward for the supply chain within the oil and gas, which I think is extremely important for the offshore wind also going forward, because the lack of competence, the lack of supply chain will maybe be one of the big challenges going forward. Thank you.
For joining us. We have some time for questions from those in the room, and I think those online can type them in a chat and someone will relay them. So do we have any questions to any of the speakers, or questions in general? There's a second microphone coming.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I have a question for Harry and also for the last speaker, maybe. So the Scottish government has opened search areas in the proximity of oil and gas platforms for future offshore wind farms, floating offshore wind farms, in order to decarbonize those platforms. So I was wondering if you know what is the how is the process going so far, and what is the partnership between the government and the industry, and if there is any timeline in this process. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure the current timeline. I think you're referring to perhaps ScotWind, which was announced, which I think is it was announced earlier this year. And I certainly know they are really looking, as you were saying, into floating wind. Certainly Scotland is, I think over the last few years, certainly the government has recognised increasingly the role of floating wind. And I think that's sort of where it's seeing a lot of its future with, and also with these concepts of, as I was saying, of systems integration. And this is also, I think, consistent as well with some of the UK government's ambitions as well. So I'm not sure about. I'm not focused too closely about when the results have been announced, but yeah, I do know that the Scottish government is very keen on pursuing floating wind. Also, has the potential for powering these platforms as well.
I got a question for the second speaker. We saw a nice scientific analysis of why and how policymakers should use scientific models. What are your thoughts about how we can actually make sure policymakers use these models?
Yes, thank you. I think it's in communication, but it's twofold. One, it's for the modelers to understand where their results will be used and how they communicate that. But we have to look at the problems they are facing and how our models can help solve the issues or put the options on the table. We have to remember we're not the decision makers. They ultimately have the decision about the policy, but these are your options. And I also feel we need to almost separate the system modeling from the decision process by moving the results over to a decision process. So we're not bogged down by the models, but we say, here are the results, these are your options, this is what it will entail, and it's communication and explanation. And I don't feel we got to that level. And that's why we tried to look at this framework that we could move between policy and project level and have that discussion, that dialogue, so communication. But understanding their needs and expectations, that would be a good start.
Any other questions?
Can I have a follow-up question to Andrew? I think you mentioned that there should be a feedback between policy and the model and like help each other. I just wondering, have you seen any example that this feedback has been implemented? Oh, thanks.
So I haven't seen an example as such. Otherwise, I'd blow my research out the water. I need to be cutting edge research here. But what I do see is this policy analysis. Is it effective? Is it working? And when it's not working, it's to introduce new mechanisms or to change the policy. So there is a feedback loop already, but that it's the chicken and the egg scenario. That policy analysis and change is affecting the projects that we're pulling through. And also the decisions on which projects we will park or which mechanisms we will not use or which mechanisms we will use. So that we do see that dynamics. It's just not structured. And that was the main aim of this frame, is to get that discussion, to feedback, to see the impact of the change and to see if we are achieving our targets. But there is policy analysis. But again, as in the scientific modeling community, we need to get better at explaining how the models work and to show the impact of the policy changes on the modeling, to changing those constraints and the parameters, and communication.
Thank you. Do we have any questions on the online portal? No? Any final question from the room?
I maybe have a question for Ben and Harry. When we look at the oil and gas industry, a topic that is maybe not discussed as much is subsidies. So being that the government is the main shareholder of the production of gas and oil in Norway, they also have an influence on the price of electricity if they decide to produce electricity with the gas. And also if we look at, if we're gonna use wind turbines to provide electricity to the oil platforms, this is another way that if we subsidize wind turbines, it's gonna be another subsidy for the oil and gas industry. How much of a role do you see subsidies have in the discussion in the energy transition in Norway?
I can let Ben answer if he's not. I've already answered the question.
No, I was going to say it's an interesting question. I mean, it's more kind of Harry's field, I think. But I think you're right, Christian. I think it's going to play quite a significant role, particularly when it comes to electrifying offshore oil platforms in Norway. So the state has a massive role to play. There was the Carbon Majors report in 2017 spoke about the 100 companies that contribute the most to global emissions. And the vast majority of them are state-owned. So the state has a huge role to play. And I think the view that these are private entities that are removed from the state, I think is quite false. But I think particularly when it comes to offshore wind development, floating offshore as well, and these oil platforms, there is a debate emerging in Norway about the role of subsidies. And when it comes to electrifying offshore oil platforms, it's going to be extremely expensive, but the cost is kind of strangely a second consideration because it's about meeting domestic CO2 targets. And in countries like Norway, you have already quite a low level of emissions. About 25% of the total emissions in Norway come from oil and gas production. So targeting that comes at an absolute priority. So subsidies will play a massive role, I think.
Yeah, just also added that, yeah, definition of subsidies is also, up for debate a bit as well. It depends what you define as a subsidy. But obviously the oil and gas industry, that they argue that, they are, eager to, diversify and go into low carbon technologies, but, there has to be a business case for them as well. So that's sort of, well, at the moment, certainly in the UK, that's sort of the discussions are going on is, how to create the business case, what's going to be the model for, looking at stuff like hydrogen and CCS. So on one case, there's, if you are really looking to encourage and accelerate diversification, then you are going to need to there's going to have to be a business case for them I think realistically. So, but these are sort of, I know some of the current debates that are going on at the moment is, how do you create the business models and the subsidy schemes for, hydrogen and CCS. So we'll see what the outcome of that is.
Okay, thank you very much.
If I may comment on that, I think the subsidy is a word that we normally don't like. It's about technology development. Is how can you develop these technologies to be a cost-efficient solution going forward, and then it could be wise to use doing this job, especially for floating, since that's some years still ahead to getting cost competitive there. And the same going for hydrogen and CCUS. I think for bottom fix, I think the subsidy will be very difficult to get through in Norway, but for, as I said, for floating, it's about how contribute to develop the technology.
So welcome back, everyone. Also for those who are joining us online. We will be continuing the program this afternoon with session 3, which will be about actor-oriented strategies to accelerate the energy transition in the North Sea region, which will be shared by Mats Pak-Nielsen. Mats, can you hear us? Are you?
Yes,
yes.
Loud and clear.
Then I'll give the word to you. You'll be sharing this session, so good luck.
Yes. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. It has been a very interesting conference, I think, looking into this very interdisciplinary field. Today I will give a small talk on renewable fuels in the transition to a 100% renewable society, and look into some very concrete Danish cases. You can here see a picture of our department, and you're of course very welcome to visit us if you go to Denmark, some of you. You can also take a virtual tour in our labs if you would like to. This is from our P2X and renewable energy conversion lab, where we have fuel cells and electrolyzers. But you can do that online. If we look at the Danish energy system, I have here a Sankey diagram showing the energy mix in Denmark. So in the upper left corner, you can see our supply of our own production, our primary energy sources. And below you can see what we import. And then the right side of the figure, you can see where the energy is used and consumed, and how much is exported. In between, you can see the conversion process. And the green lines we can see here is the share of renewable energy currently in the Danish energy mix. So all the other lines are fossil fuel resources. It's natural gas, coal, oil products, either raw oil or refined oil. And you can see the conversion to power, the red lines in the right part of the picture, and the district heating here. And you can also see the interconnections. So what we can tell from this figure is that we are currently only covering about 10% of our overall energy with renewable energy sources coming from wind, solar, and biogas. And the remaining part of our renewable energy come from biomass and a very small amount of geothermal energy, which is 132 petajoules out of our total final consumption of 637 petajoules. So basically, we need to make this entire figure green to meet the Danish energy targets. By 2030, we need to have 70% renewable energy in the total energy mix. And by 2050, the goal is that we need to have 100% renewable energy. So this is, of course, a very ambitious transition that requires a lot of sector coupling. Sectors that currently produce fuel need to suddenly integrate with also the heat and the power supply, the energy supply system. We can also see that transportation is a quite significant part of the energy we use in Denmark. It's 223 petajoule approximately currently. And out of that, only a very small share is actually electric transportation. We're talking about electrifying our transport system, obviously with electrical vehicles, as this is a very efficient way to convert our energy into traction. But there's still quite a long way, and we also need infrastructure to facilitate this. So a question we often receive is why not just make fuels directly from biomass instead of power to X? And the reason for this is that the chemical composition of our conventional fuels we use for aviation, for ships, and for vehicles have a very different composition than what we would gain directly from biomass. We need to hydrogenate our fuels by adding hydrogen we can get from electrolysis, and this also increases the useful yield by a factor of 3 if we have renewable electricity available. Then we can, by power to X, combine either carbon dioxide sources or take nitrogen from the air, combine this with hydrogen, and we can produce renewable fuels and chemicals. Furthermore, if we do not combust our biomass, our sources of carbon in particular, we can also recycle important minerals like phosphorus, which is also a mineral that can be shortage of in the future. We have estimated the maximum annual biomass potential in Denmark to 123 petajoules approximately. This is, of course, a very crude estimate, so my accuracy here is maybe a bit exaggerated. But this biomass also have to cover all the non-energy usage applications. And the requirement for liquid fuels is expected to be 100 petajoules by 2050. If we assume that the remaining transport modes can be electrified. So obviously, we could easily have a shortage of biomass. Furthermore, when we have intermittent energy sources in the energy system, we need to have a way of balancing our grid. So here we also need to either produce hydrogen, store this in some way, and convert this back to electricity when we need it in order to have a grid balancing services. So these are the main reasons for this. We cannot electrify our entire transportation system. If we look at some examples, our heavy transport trucks, normally if we have a truck, we expect a range of about 1,500 kilometers with a 60-ton payload. And if we use the current state-of-the-art battery technologies, this means that we would have 30 tons of batteries on board the truck. So the payload would be greatly diminished. So we would have to accept lower ranges, and we have to consider still high density energy fuels such as methanol or maybe even biodiesels. If we look at ships, the problem is even worse. If we need a 10,000 kilometer range for a big container ship having a 60,000 tons payload, we need 55,000 tons of batteries. So here methanol, ammonia, and hydrogen are the main fuels. Consider liquefied hydrogen, that is. There are projects on that in Denmark. And for planes, of course, it's completely out of range. Jet fuels must have a very high energy density, at least higher than 40 megajoules per kilo, because the batteries would simply weigh more than the payload we need in the system. I'll just give an example of one kind of power-to-X system. We have a pilot plant here at our department where we can produce 300,000 liters of methanol based on CO2 from biogas, and we have an alkaline electrolysis plant of 350 kilowatts in this system. Of course, this plant is not operated continuously. We cannot afford that at the university. But if we take a typical Danish biogas plant and integrate a plant like this, we would produce roughly 1.5 tons of very pure carbon dioxide that we can quite easily purify and use for methanol synthesis. That would require a 10 megawatt renewable power in an electrolysis conversion for the hydrogen, and then we get a mixture of methanol and water we need to distill. So actually here from one plant we would be able to make 14 to 15,000 cars CO2 neutral, and it would be out without changing much in the existing infrastructure. We can easily modify our filling stations and our infrastructure transporting methanol instead of gasoline. And the maximum potential for a production like this from biogas has been estimated to be 35 petajoules. So we can cover about a third of our requirement of liquid fuels in 2050 if we follow this pathway. The system we need depends, of course, on the energy source we use. It can be renewable energy, it can be waste products, it can be pyrolysis and liquefaction, and we can base our fuels on different feedstocks like CO2 and nitrogen, as I mentioned. Then we have some intermediate products. We have different fuels depending on the end user, whether it's industrial use or it's transportation in different modes like small vehicles, heavy fuel transport and heavy transport, and ships or planes. And it's a very complicated system that has to be integrated in many different ways. So there are really a lot of actors involved in this, both supplying all these technologies, but also we need to integrate all the technologies in an efficient way. We've already talked about regaining the heat is really important because we will have quite significant heat losses in this system. And in a country like Denmark, we obviously can use the heat for district heating purposes. But a very complicated system, and we have a very complex transition going from now and also 2050 with many intermediate stages. I've, at the end of the presentation, made a link for our roadmap where you can see the details of how we see all the stages. I will not go through all these in this presentation. Another thing is that often politicians refer to technologies as they already exist. When we talk about a methanol synthesis plant, it's not the same technology as we know today in large-scale methanol production we need in a future power-to-X system. We need systems that can operate much more flexibly, requiring a very different electricity, a power infrastructure, a control system, and also the entire chemical conversion plant has to be different. And very often I hear politicians in Denmark and also elsewhere refer to technologies to have a very high technology readiness level. And all these technologies you saw on the figure before actually are at very, very different stages. And I think this is something we really have to be aware of when we discuss this transition. to a renewable energy system in the North Sea region, we really have to look into what kind of research requirements do we have, what kind of transition can we make at what particular time. So this is really important to consider, and often we debate things that are TRL1 as if it was something we could build tomorrow. This is an example of a real-life system from our local municipality, Aalborg. We have a cement factory, Aalborg Portland, which is the largest point source of carbon dioxide in Denmark. And they would like to capture all their carbon dioxide and utilize it for fuels, the biogenic part of the CO2 from the chimney, and then also transport the black CO2. It could have been used for producing blue fuels, as we have also discussed previously, but currently the Danish political debate is that you should only use the biogenic part, and we should use carbon capture and sequestration, pump it back, transport it in liquid form back in oil fields or elsewhere. In Aalborg, we have different sources of carbon dioxide, different factories. We also have a relatively big waste incineration plant, and we need to integrate all these systems for this process to work. And it's really complicated technologies. The capture process requires a lot of heat, so the utilization plant produces heat, and we need to integrate all these systems for a system like this to work. So we have really a lot of actors and a lot of actants in form of these technologies that have to interact. And also the involvement of the people living in the municipality, educating politicians and others that need to make these decisions is really important. And who should supply the infrastructure for the carbon dioxide? Should it be like roads, or should it be the companies or people making collaborations that do this? So here we really have a lot of complex issues. Yes, this is what I would like to present for you today, but I've provided a few links for some of the projects I've mentioned here, so you can get more information, and a link for our roadmap for green fuels and transportation in Denmark. And you're of course also very welcome to write me if you have questions to this.